have I saw Adam on one point TV. Michael may be enabling. All right, we'll do it. Good morning. I'm John Fortier, the director of the Democracy Project at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Happy Valentine's Day. You know, what better day or what better present for your sweetheart than to improve American elections? So we're all here for that purpose. I'm here with Adam Ambrogi and Matt Weil to open this conference, but you are all participants, and we are here with a great wealth of knowledge about elections. I will be brief. This is a conference looking back and also looking forward, looking back to some of the great progress that we've made in election administration over the years, in particular since the Bauer-Ginsburg Commission, which we've worked very closely to try to push forward some of those recommendations, looking back to the 2018 election, the recent experiences, but then also looking forward to work that we hope we can do with all of you, especially having some new task forces pushing forward in some areas that Matt Weil will take some time to describe. So again, with BPC joining the Democracy Fund, we welcome you here today. We've got a great day, and I'm going to welcome Adam Ambrogi.
Thanks, John, and as well, Matt Weil, Jason Grumet will be joining us later. Our team at Democracy Fund, who's worked on assembling the panels, the great conversations we're having today. My name's Adam Ambrogi. I'm the program director for the elections team at the Democracy Fund, a private foundation that works on issues on governance, improving how Congress functions, working on the public square, how journalism can be supported and grown in this moment. And then, of course, we work on election issues here. One of the reasons why we were proud to sponsor this event today is that this really is somewhat of a milestone. It's been now 5 years since the Presidential Commission on Election Administration, the Bauer-Ginsburg Commission, created after the 2012 elections with long lines and a lot of other challenges and policy and administration concerns, came together with election officials, business leaders, political leaders to try to figure out bipartisan solutions to what we saw happen in the 2012 election. And I really do think there are a lot of election officials in the room, there are a lot of policy advocates and experts in the room, you know, trying to find that window and that opportunity to come together, be data-driven around how you fix some of these big policy challenges is just incredibly important. Many of you know that before my job at Democracy Fund, I was a Hill staffer. I work for the Rules Committee that handles rules of the Senate, money and politics issues, and election administration and voting work. And during that time as a staffer, I worked across the aisle with great colleagues for a number of years on achieving good oversight issues. We worked together to pass the Military and Overseas Voter Empowerment Act, work on a variety of work on the Election Assistance Commission and helping getting some of those commissioners confirmed. I'm glad to see that now there is a full complement of commissioners. Welcome Don Palmer and Ben Hovland, as well as existing commissioners Tom Hicks. I know Christy McCormick could not be here today. One of the reasons I decided to leave the Senate is that over my 7 years, even folks across the aisle that I had excellent relationships with, I'd come to them with a bill, election security and a process, or things related to fixes in the Help America Vote Act, crafted in a way that I thought was pretty good, pretty down the line, focused on data and policy. And over the years, the response I would get from friends and colleagues that I worked with and worked on bills before had been, listen, I like this. I think my boss actually likes this. We just can't sponsor a bill at all with you, meaning someone from the other side at this point in time. We're going to get killed in the primary. Even though we agree with this, we think this would make the system better. And to me, the work that BPC and the grantees and civil society partners, as well as the election officials and cell phone manufacturers, no, have done both with the Presidential Commission and its aftermath in implementing that over the last 5 years, is necessary to move this field forward. And so now 5 years later, there's been a lot of changes in the field. There's been some good, some bad, a lot of good familiar friends, and some new faces. I really do hope that we'll take today to think about what's the next step. We have great recommendations 5 years ago from the PCEA. We need to start thinking about where are the next challenges? How do we solve current problems within the system? That's what I'm going to be curious about. I'm going to be trying to think about how we can build bridges in the field and try to figure out how we innovate and work together to solve these issues. So thank you all for being here today, for traveling so far to get here, and working with all of us to make this happen. So thank you and have a great day.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you to your entire team at the Democracy Fund. They've been very helpful as we've planned this event. Public events like this one that we are excited to start momentarily are important to the field. They give local, state, and federal election administrators and policymakers the opportunity to interact with one another and the public. As John mentioned, BPC is honored to have taken in-house the work of the Presidential Commission on Election Administration 5 years ago and continue our work today. And we have a stellar lineup of panelists and moderators throughout the day for you. A few housekeeping things to the top here. If you're tweeting or Facebooking about this, and we have Twitter and Facebook on panels today, so I encourage you to do so, please use our hashtag, #TheVotingExperience, so that we can keep track of all of that. And also, if you are in the room today, and you're not following online, I'm sorry, we have an election, a poll that you can vote in. I've been assured that it is secure. Ashley over there is on our IT team, and she said everything is safe about it. And the great thing about it is that we're going to have lightning quick tallying of results that I'll be sharing with you later. So make sure you do vote. Make sure you get your sticker that you voted. My role up here right now is to announce a new initiative of the Bipartisan Policy Center that John alluded to. To further the development of election policies that are informed by those who actually administer elections, BPC is organizing 3 new task forces on the elections process. These task forces, which are being assembled now and over the next 2 or 3 weeks, will research, discuss, and deliberate policy reforms for voter registration, casting a vote, and counting the votes. It is clear that voter registration has improved both since the passage of Motor Voter, HAVA, and the recommendations of the PCEA. It is also clear that more reform is needed to meet voters' evolving expectations of the process. Clean and accurate lists are vital to efficient election administration, and the Task Force on Voter Registration will look at the entire process from start to finish. Similarly, the ways Americans cast their votes look different today than they did 15 years ago and 15 years before that. The process must continue to evolve to meet voter expectations within an election ecosystem that administrators can manage and for which resources are available. Whether it is voting by mail, early voting, vote centers, or the traditional polling place, we know that better policy leads to better administered elections. Finally, The vote counting, recounting, auditing, and certification process is largely a black box for voters and for many policymakers, both at the state and federal level. Moreover, some laws and policies are outdated and unrealistic that end up forcing ad hoc solutions or that wind up in court after Election Day. These facts have led to numerous after-Election Day controversies that tend to weaken confidence in the electoral system and increase voter cynicism. So BPC will be using these task forces to develop recommendations for state and federal legislators to improve the voting experience for all Americans. We are excited to be conducting our first task force meetings in April, and you should expect to hear more about BPC's task forces over the next few months. At this time, I want to call our first panel up to the stage. You guys can take your seats. While they're coming up, BPC created a few graphics we wanted to share to show where we've been and how far we've come. I think I have a clicker here. I think it's already put up here. This first slide shows the rapid adoption of online voter registration across the country, from just 12 states in 2012 to 38 states implemented by 2018. Our next slide shows the number of states that are doing data sharing of voter registration information among each other. It's advanced from the 7 initial states to 26 today, including the District of Columbia. Our next slide shows a more recent reform that is sweeping the country. 11 states have moved towards automatic voter registration. This reform means different things in different states, but the general idea is that the state does more proactive voter registration as opposed to passively accepting registrations. And finally, this slide over here shows the number of states that have some form of same-day registration, either during early voting or on Election Day. So these are new reforms that are happening, that voters are hearing about, that some voters are starting to expect. Now into panel 1. This panel is going to discuss a modern and secure voter registration process, and it's my great privilege to introduce Chris Thomas. I don't think anybody in this room doesn't know Chris, and so he probably doesn't need much of an introduction, having been in and around elections for 40 years, but you're going to get one anyway. Chris is now a valued member of the BPC elections team. He serves as a fellow at BPC and is one of our main conduits between our work and state and local election officials all across the country. Chris has been the state election director of Michigan, and he's a former commissioner of the Presidential Commission on Election Administration. And with that, I'm going to hand this first panel off to Chris.
Well, good morning. Thank you, Matt. It's a pleasure to be here, and I guess I'd be remiss if I did not acknowledge and note that today John Dingell's funeral is being held here in Washington, and he'll be interred out at Arlington later today. Obviously, he's a long-serving Michigan congressman, and it was a delight to know. One of the privileges of being the director of elections in Michigan is that John Dingell filed his petitions in person. He did not trust that to anybody else but himself. But when he would come, we would get a 30 to 45-minute seminar, which was just fascinating. I mean, he would walk through history that we would love to have recorded. It was a delight that he did that, and he'll definitely be missed. So voter registration is the topic of this panel. I sat down the other night and put some notes together, and I just thought, well, postcard registration, third-party registration, election day registration, motor-voter, pre-registration, online registration, and now automatic voter registration. So we have this panoply of different types of voting reforms that have come along as the years have gone on. But here we are. We're still seeing it as an issue, that barriers still exist, and that there's still this expectation that hasn't quite been filled that we really would have a more modern and integrated voter registration system than we do. We certainly are better off than we were without all of these programs. We register millions of voters with ease every election year and each year. So real policy changes, I think, can help dial down some of the confrontation and angst that's involved in the process of voter registration. And so today I'm pleased to have a great panel here, and I'll do just a brief introduction and then we'll start into our business. So on my far left, Elaine Manlove from Delaware. She's the Commissioner of Elections, which is a great title. I mean, there's no Secretary of State, there's no Board of Elections, there's just the Commissioner, you know, what a nice place to be. And it's so nice that she's actually thinking about retiring, but we're pleased that she's not. Keith Ingram is the Director of Elections from Texas. And he has also just been sworn in as the new president of the National Association of State Election Directors. Another person who does need no introduction is Tom Hicks. Yes, yeah, right, yeah, you, who's the chair of the U.S. Election Assistance Commission. And I've known Tom for many years, and I think first knew him when he was House Administration back in the HAVA days. And finally, Shane Hamlin is the Executive Director of the Electronic Registration Information Center, better known as ERIC. And he also has his roots in state elections. He was the co-director of Washington state elections. So this morning, we're going to begin with you, Tom. And so tell us a little bit about what's going on in voter registration with the Election Assistance Commission.
Thank you, Chris. Really appreciate it to be here today. And one of the things I wanted to add on to when you were talking about Congressman Dingell, it's really amazing that there are two members from Michigan who are both the two longest serving members of Congress, with John Dingell and John Conyers. So, yes. They both, well, John Dingell will definitely be missed. So my name is Thomas Hicks. I'm chairman of the United States Election Assistance Commission. I want to thank the Bipartisan Policy Center for inviting me here today, and the Democracy Fund and Adam Ambrosi for also sponsoring this lovely event. I'm going to speak to you briefly about online voter registration, some of the things the Election Assistance Commission is doing, a little bit of automatic voter registration as well. Voter registration is basically the backbone of the American democracy. I spoke a little bit about this yesterday in my testimony to Congress. It's basically the front lines on which Americans have that touch of democracy for the first time. Since the EAC was established in 2002, technology has significantly changed the way that people register to vote and the way that voter rolls are maintained. While paper is still the primary method that people register to vote, more than 75% of the country now has some form of online voter registration. And according to the Election Administration Voting Survey, EVES, which is done by the EAC, more than 17% of folks register or have registered using online methods. That's more than 3 times the average that it was done in 2012. 37 states now have online voter registration, including the District of Columbia, and Oklahoma and Michigan have recently passed legislation, but it's not really fully implemented. In 2018, Congress appropriated $380 million for election administration to the states, and 14% of that was used towards online voter registration or some form of improving the registration processes, more likely, across 29 states. Massachusetts, which the capital is Boston, for most of you who don't know, but also most of us call it Titletown. Just making sure that folks are awake. Spent more than $4 million of its $7 million in state funds for voter registration systems. And according to our federal financial reports, which ended on September 30th of last year, Nearly 7% of those funds have already been expended by states for this purpose. I'm not going to go too much into this because I know that Chris has a lot of questions, but there's other couple of pieces that I wanted to briefly touch on, and that's automatic and same-day voter registration. When Chris and I were working towards what became the Help America Vote Act with other folks in this room and activists, members of Congress, and so forth, automatic registration was not even thought of. So, you know, basically, it's done by a number of states now. Same-day voter registration didn't really exist before 1970 or so, which Oregon basically took the lead on. And then I'm going to leave out the NVRA stuff for now and then wait towards so it's that time. So I'll just leave it at that and then answer questions as we go along.
Excellent. Thank you, Tom. Elaine?
Well, I'm going to talk about Delaware's AVR, which we were really not. We developed what we called e-signature back, we started after the 2000 election. In the 2000 election, which was my first election, working as an election official, I spent the day doing court orders. We could tell someone had been to DMV, but we didn't have an application. So in order for them to vote, we had to go to court, and it became an automated process. We faxed the information to the court. They gave us an okay, and after a little while, I got to be a phone call to the court, and then the next day we went back and with all the paperwork and got the official court orders just to speed things up at the polling place. So right after that election, that was my first election. I couldn't imagine all these people went to DMV and we did not have that paperwork. So I started talking then about how to make it better, and we started talking about an electronic signature. I used to say if I went to Macy's and I signed a credit card, you know, on that pad, it would land on my bill. And how could Delaware, in one, you know, small state but all integrated, how could we not do that? So we started talking to DMV, started talking to our Department of Technology and Information, and it was a slow process. Not everybody was on board, and DMV would have busy periods, and elections would have busy periods, and we would have to stop and then pick it up later. What really made the difference was HAVA. When we got HAVA funds, we were going to pay for everything, so then they were all on board. But still, it was slow, and a new director of DMV was appointed in 2008, and it was a woman, and I went to her, and I said, we have this idea, and she said, let's do it, and in less than a year, we were live. So in Delaware, when you go to DMV, everything is on a script on the screen for the clerks, and they ask you then if you want to register to vote. When you say yes or no, everything comes up on the signature pad for the credit card. So you choose, certify that you're a citizen, choose your party, and sign. If you decline, you sign that pad also saying you are declining to register to vote. All that information comes in real time directly to the Department of Elections in whichever county you live. So if you register in one county and live in another, it will land in a queue in the county where you live. They're processed that day. Polling place cards go out that night. So what used to take maybe 2 to 3 weeks to get your polling place card in the mail now is same-day service. And I always say that my goal in the beginning was just to get everything from DMV, but e-signature changed all that. We had nothing to verify anymore. We didn't have any paper to file, so it freed up a lot of office space. There were a lot of unintended consequences that were actually bigger than the intended consequence of just getting everything. So in Delaware, probably 90% of our voter registrations come from DMV, and e-signature has just made that just amazingly different. On e-signature, we built online voter registration using some of the same technology. We also, if we get paper applications in the office, the clerks in the offices, the county offices will do data entry, and then they scan in that paper with the signature, link it electronically, and then we, you know, shred that piece of paper. So it has changed dramatically the way we do business in all of our offices. And it was paid for with HAVA money. So we did this, and we went live in 2009. I think it was kind of the precursor to automatic voter registration. But what I like about it is when you leave DMV, you're finished. We don't send out anything asking you to change party or opt out. you've chosen your party, you've either registered or declined to register, your polling place card goes out that night, so there is no follow-up. So it saves us, I think, money by not having to send out paper. It also, we're a closed primary state. If we registered everyone as unaffiliated and they didn't make that change, I think the Democrats and Republicans would both hang me on Election Day when people came in and weren't able to vote. So it's been a huge innovation for us. We've connected with other agencies, and it has been a complete success story, so I'm happy to share it.
Thank you very much. Keith?
Thank you. Thanks, Chris, and thanks to BPC for having me here today. You know, if you're going to have a modern voter registration system, you've got to have a modern voter registration system. It's sort of axiomatic. And when I got to Texas in 2012, we did not have, we had a HAVA-compliant voter registration database, sort of. And it sort of worked sometimes, except on Election Day. And we had it in-house, and so we had to manage it. So it was unreliable, it was unpredictable, the costs were unpredictable. We didn't know how much it was going to cost from year to year. And so one of the first things that I undertook was to replace that system. In 2013, we hired a consultant. I don't know if y'all have ever appreciated the strength, weakness, opportunity, threat, SWOT analysis, you know, all that consultant speak, and, you know, but we went through that whole process. And the thing is that you have to do that process. You have to make that work, because you don't really know what you need until you've done something like that. So we went through all of that in 2013, decided we needed to replace the system rather than to fix the one we had. And that's what we did in 2014, hired the same consultant to work with the request for proposal and all the documents that we have to file in other state agencies to do a procurement of this size. And by the end of 2014, we had a contract. The contractor that we hired, you know, to implement the voter registration system said it would take 2 years to implement. And we said, well, we're in December of 14, we need to have this in place before November of 15. And they said, okay. And so we had the first counties on the system in May of 2015. We had all the counties on by September of 2015. We went into a maintenance phase by spring of 2016, and it has been an absolute dream. It is a wonderful thing to have an election day where your voter registration database stays up. And that's a kind of an important foundational thing. And since we've had such good success with our new voter registration system, our new team, Texas Election Administration, anyway, since we've had good success with team, we're now using this newest HAVA money to implement candidate management, election night returns, canvassing. We're going to make the whole thing an integrated election management system so that we are better positioned to use data and have data, better data, quicker, going forward. Anyway, that's what I know about that.
Thank you. Shane?
Yeah. First, I'd like to thank the Bipartisan Policy Center and Democracy Fund for inviting me to participate in this panel and share information about ERIC and contribute to this important conversation. So for those of you that don't know, ERIC is a nonprofit membership organization. Our members are the chief election officials or chief election authority in each member state. We currently have 26 members, 25 states and the District of Columbia. We're governed by a board of directors who are our members, and in that way, our members are self-governing in the organization. We were founded in 2012 after a few years of work under the leadership and with the assistance from Pew's Elections Initiative program. And when we were building ERIC, we were really trying to solve a number of problems that we knew about as election administrators in the field of voter registration, but also based on some recent research that was done at that time. We knew that there were a high number of inaccurate voter registration records, primarily due to a very mobile population. In any given year, the Census Bureau estimates between 11 and 15% of the population moves, depending on the jurisdiction. We also knew at that time that a large number of voters and the public assumed the government was already using and sharing data to update their records. It didn't make sense to them that government would have data in these silos. And so we knew from the surveys that there was an expectation that we were already sharing data or already being efficient with their data. And then we knew that at that time, and this was again 2009 to 2012, that the voter registration systems used across the country were inefficient and relied heavily on paper-based voter registration. Thinking back at this time, there were very few states who had online registration. I think there were fewer than 4 of us that had online registration. So those were important challenges that we were trying to tackle when we built and launched ERIC in 2012. So ERIC addresses those problems by providing its members with actionable data on voters who have moved within the jurisdiction but haven't updated their registration, voters who've moved from one ERIC state to another but haven't canceled their old registration, and voters who've passed away. We do this by we use a very sophisticated, very powerful data matching engine that analyzes our members' voter registration records and driver's licensing data, as well as death data from the Social Security Administration. And we provide actionable reports back to our members to help them keep their lists more accurate, remove those deceased voters, and update their records. We also use and provide national change of address reports using U.S. Postal Service data. And since these actions are all aimed at improving the accuracy of their voter rolls, which results in removing ineligible voters or deceased voters, we also require our members to use our services to identify potentially eligible but unregistered individuals so they can reach out and provide them with information on how to efficiently register to vote, usually pointing them to an online registration portal. That was another important founding principle of ERIC, is that we create this balanced system that we provide both the accuracy piece but also improve access to voter registration. So those two components are part of our membership agreement and part of what our members commit to doing, keeping their rolls more accurate and reaching out to eligible citizens and helping them to get registered to vote. Since we launched in 2012, ERIC's identified about 10 million voter records that were inaccurate or needed to be updated, or deceased voters who needed to be removed. About 70% of those are in-state updates. Those are addresses that were out of date within the state, which we'll probably talk about this. That sort of reflects the quality of a state's NVRA program or how well it's working in that state. About 25% of those 10 million records are voters who moved from one state to another but hadn't canceled their old registration. And then the remainder are deceased voters or duplicate registrations. Since that time, we've also identified about 38 million potentially eligible but unregistered individuals, and our states have reached out to them with information on how to register. So in terms of list maintenance, I think list maintenance is important for a couple of reasons, and you heard some of them here, and we're going to talk about them today. But voter registration really is sort of the foundation upon which elections are conducted and built. Not only are they important in terms of that first interaction for participating in our electoral process, but also from an administrative perspective, voter list maintenance is really important. If in a vote-by-mail state, voter list maintenance is vital to ensure you're not mailing ballots to a bad address and either dealing with returned ballots, which is inefficient and a waste of resources. If you're forwarding ballots, it can reduce the opportunity for fraud. So that improves both efficiency, costs, and the voting experience. If you have a family member who recently passed away, getting a ballot for that deceased family member does not provide for a good voting experience, does not instill trust and confidence in the system. So in a vote-by-mail environment, voter list maintenance is very, very important. In a poll site environment, it's important, again, for the voting experience on election day. Showing up at the poll site and being told you're at the wrong place because you moved, that's not good for the voter. Telling them they have to drive across town or go somewhere else, that's not going to provide a good experience, not going to instill trust and confidence in the system. It also means you have some inefficiencies on election day. It can lead to longer lines, more problems at check-in, et cetera. So voter list maintenance in poll site and vote by mail, very important. And then there's the optics issue, which we all are aware of. It's not uncommon to have more registered voters in a jurisdiction than voters. However, when you start talking significantly more, it causes a problem, again, undermining confidence in the process, but it also provides fodder for those that are really focused on fraud. And then those of you that administer elections, you know that voter registration serves a much more fundamental purpose. Your ballots are built around geographic information, which candidates, which ballot measures, which levies and bond measures of voters eligible to vote on. And if you don't have the right information for them, that undermines the entire process of ensuring they get the right ballot, asking them to vote on the right bond measures that affect their taxes. So there's that base administrative level that's not very exciting and doesn't get talked about a lot, but it's sort of the foundation and one of the important building blocks underlying voter registration.
Thank you. Thank you all for your comments. Looking at statewide voter registration systems and going back to the HAVA days that brought that forward for all of the states to create, and it was quite a challenging process to get those up and running. one of the reasons I retired is that the state said that our voter registration system that we pioneered in the 90s was a legacy system. So I thought, well, there's a hint. So, so Keith, given the centrality of these systems for any kind of file maintenance, implementation of reforms such as OVR, automatic registration, did you take that into account as you put the system together in terms of the flexibility that is needed in these systems to make those successful programs?
Absolutely. That was the reason why the RFP process took as long as it did in 2014 was because we wanted to make sure that we had something that was a base upon which we could build as the legislature directed policy. We needed to have something that was flexible. I don't know if y'all are familiar, in Texas we have a hybrid system. It's all bottom up, but our largest counties have their own voter registration election management systems, and then they batch process with us overnight. And then the smaller counties, about 215 of them, interface with team directly. Well, we needed a system that accomplished both of those goals and was scalable and buildable for the future. And so that's it was a complicated process, but we think that we've got a product that works.
So that was a big decision by the EAC in the early days, top down, bottom up. And I did talk to Tom about that, and it doesn't sound like there's going to be any change in that policy.
There will not be. It's more of allowing states to do what they feel is best for their constituencies. So if a state wants to go bottom up to or top down, the EAC can give guidance on how to best do that, but it's up to each individual state to dictate the way that they want to do it.
So Shane, I would imagine that the flexibility of these systems impacts you in terms of their ability to take the data and use the data after you provide it to them. So, you know, one of the flows is the data comes from the states to ERIC, but then when it comes back, their systems need to be able to manipulate that and get it out to the proper jurisdictions.
Right, right. And I would say that whether it's a top up or a bottom down is less important than whether or not it's modern, flexible, is it adaptable to policy changes, because one thing we've seen since HAVA is a number of policy changes that have been listed off here that all require or that would be easier to implement if the voter registration system is flexible and can be changed pretty easily to comply with whatever the new policy is. And in terms of ERIC, we have a variety of states among our 26 in terms of the architecture of their system. Those states that have modern systems that can take in the data electronically obviously are implementing ERIC more efficiently. I would say not to favor one architecture over another, but systems that are top down, where the states can feed data down to the counties and they can process those records, process those reports, are probably experiencing a more efficient ERIC report processing than those states who have sort of bottom-up or hybrids. And when ERIC first launched, there were a number of us that were providing data back to our counties in sort of files, exports, not integrated into the system. So it is important as states, and a lot of states are doing this right now. They're upgrading their systems because it's been over 12 years. And I'm sure they're all thinking about this, but that's ensuring that those systems are flexible, easy to change as new innovations come on board.
Exactly. So one of the things that was central to the PCEA was the operation of the motor voter program, the NVRA. And we found during the testimony that was given and the reports we read that it really wasn't meeting the full expectations that had been envisioned for them back in 1993 when it was originally enacted. The states vary greatly in terms of the percentage of applications that came from their DMV. With a high, Michigan, we were in the 80s. Elaine in Delaware was around the 90 percentile.
I think 85 to 90, yeah.
Yeah, and then there were big drop-offs, and that was very concerning to the commission. So, you know, it's an issue that's improved somewhat, But what we've really looked at is how have some of the new programs. So for a while, we saw OVR come in, and in those states that really didn't operate well with the DMV, we saw huge transactions with online. So that was, in essence, supplementing. And as Shane indicated, when you see 70% of their transactions being intrastate, within a state, that tells you that the motor voter program is really not working. Because as people change their address, those files should stay very close together. So we've looked a little bit at the AVR, at the automatic registration. And what I'd like to do now is just give you a little data, because everybody says things are data-driven. That's the way we should proceed. During the PCA, that's what we got on OVR. The states that had the courage to move forward with that brought some very impressive data to the table to show that that system was operating and how well it operated. Well, likewise, I've just seen a couple of presentations, one from Georgia and the other from Vermont, on their AVR, and I'd like to just share some data with you. So in Georgia, they implemented it in September of 2016, so it didn't have a big impact on that election. But their new registrations in 2015 were 113,000, and in 2016 it was 142,000. Now going into 17 and 18 with full functioning AVR, their transactions were 352,000 and in 17 and 329,000 in 18, an extremely significant increase. And the significance here is looking at the odd year, not just the election year. That follows through with change of address. In 15, they had 73,000. In 17, they had 355,000. And in 18, 376,000. I mean, those are just absolutely impressive numbers. Their total, which are all the status changes that come with name changes and everything that have a voter registration transaction attached, went from 390,000 in 2015 to 1.6 million in 2017 and 1.7 million in 2018. So while we're not here to advocate for AVR, we are here to say that it appears that motor voter is the beneficiary, well, in addition to the voters, but that's what's making the promise of motor voter actually come to the fore. Now, I would note, too, that Vermont had a similar change. So in 2015, they had 9,000 transactions. And in 2017 and 2018, each of them, they had 19,000 transactions. So again, another state, very different portion of the country, different populations show a similar increase in terms of transactions there. So Tom, let me talk a little bit about the NVRA and what its promise was and what it said concerning the registration at the DMVs during the driver's license process.
Well, one of the things I wanted to jump on as well is that I don't think the audience fully took in what you were just saying with the basically triple the numbers for Georgia. Georgia was in the news a lot this last election cycle, particularly for machines, but I think it might be lost that the number of transactions that they had with automatic voter registration. So folks keep looking at Georgia as being, and I'm really defensive of it because that's where my parents were born. But it's more of, all this talk of how, old-fashioned and non-modern and so forth, but they have automatic voter registration and moving forward towards a number of other things. So I think that, for those numbers that you just gave, I think that that's a significant advancement in particular for moving forward. I would note that that with the National Voter Registrations Act, that's one of the hallmarks of what the EAC is titled to or mandated to accomplish. And we processed about 9 changes to the state forms in 2018. It's still one of the, we house a form on our website, and an electronic version of it. You have to download that, sign it, and send it back. But for the most part, that particular part of our website is the most viewed that we have. I'm still trying to get my commissioner page to be more viewed, but we'll see. So that's, you know, I think that it's, with the NVRA or Motor Voter, I think that it's been really helpful in terms of adding other aspects of it, so particularly being translated in other languages. There are currently 9 other languages than English that it's translated into. So I think of it as something that can be improved, but it's something there in addition to allow for folks to register to vote. The other aspect of that is that you know, one of the things that I looked at when I was preparing for this, and we haven't really talked about, is overseas and military voters with this, so that if you know, to join the military, you're usually 18 or 18 and above, other than, you know, extenuating circumstances. But so when those folks get to be 18 and they're overseas, and what sort of ways can they use to register to vote? Most of those folks turn to either online voter registration or a hard form. So using the NVRA to do that. For American citizens who were born overseas that have never had a touch with the U.S. in terms of actually being on U.S. soil, even though they have two U.S. born parents, there are still 5 or 6 states that don't allow for them to register to vote. So as we look towards improving the registration process, those are a couple of things that I think that we should particularly pay attention to.
Elaine, do you can contrast your e-signature program with AVR a bit?
Sure. I think the main difference is when our voters leave DMV, they're finished. They don't have to get something in the mail and then respond to it or make any changes. And I think it's more cost effective because we don't have to do a mailing. Everything is handled there, and polling place cards go out that night. It's been the greatest thing we ever did. It dramatically changed the way we did business right from the beginning. We don't have any paper to file. So on election day, they're bringing everything up online. It's not a matter of going back to the file cabinet and looking for the voter registration application. So, and at DMV, we also piggyback on their online system. If somebody uses DMV to change an address, that also connects with us. And DMV has a kiosk system, and they are connected with us as well.
Thank you. I think you told a story last night that Oregon you're somewhat responsible for the Oregon system.
Yeah, Oregon did come to Delaware to see what we did and went back, and I thought they were going to do the same thing, and they went back to Oregon and went to automatic voter registration, which was another step, but I think maybe they have more unaffiliated now than they used to, so it would be tough for me.
Yeah, and I would note that there are a couple different methods for the AVR. You know, a couple of states, Oregon and Alaska, do the mailing afterwards, but the remainder of them, as far as I know, all the action is taken in the Secretary of State's office, or pardon me, Secretary of State in Michigan, but DMV across the country. And Michigan right now is in the process of implementing AVR. We passed a ballot proposal this past year that did AVR and online, or pardon me, election day registration, and moving our closer registration from 30 to 15 days before the election. Keith, you had some observations on that you've seen in terms of the number of voter reg applications compared to driver license applications that are out there.
So I first want to say that the Texas Department of Public Safety is our driver's license bureau, and they have been a phenomenal partner in voter registration. They take the voter registration responsibility seriously. We implemented electronic transfer of voter registration records back in 2010. And last year we had over 700,000 applications from DPS. It was by far the largest source of new voter registrations and changes for us. We get a file every day from DPS, the daily update file, that is the changes that were made at DPS that affected voter registration. It's usually about 5,000 to 7,000 records a day. But we also get another file that we get from DPS every day that reflects all the changes, all the transactions that happened at DPS that day. And that number is more like 21,000, 22,000 every day. So if AVR were implemented in Texas, it would probably triple the number of transactions that we get related to voter registration from the DPS.
Yeah, I think those numbers are significant. And so if we had AVR across the country, Shane, and you looked at eliminating that 70% of intrastate moves that are going on, that would have a real impact.
Yes, I think it would. And actually, we already have a lot of AVR states in ERIC. It's probably not surprising that most states that adopted AVR, the early adopters, are already members of ERIC. Right. I think states in ERIC are already prone to be more innovative and embrace reforms that they see could make a benefit. So we actually have helped a number of our states implement AVR by kind of helping them do some pre-data analysis on what to expect from their DMVs or licensing agencies. And we're here to help. We don't have a position on AVR. ERIC is not an advocacy organization, but when our members need to implement it, we have helped several of them deal with it. Because it's one thing to receive electronic transactions from your motor vehicle agency, and something that Keith said that strikes me, here we are in 2018, and he talked about implementing electronic transfer of motor voters in 2010. We did that in Washington around 2008. That was only 10 years ago. When I first started in the Elections Division at the Secretary of State's office, there was someone whose job it was to take the paper forms from the DMV, sort them by county, and mail them out to the county. That was in 2007. Right. Only 11 years ago. So to come from that position of sorting paper, implementing electronic motor voter, and now we're talking about AVR, really the entire voter registration process has come a long way in the last 10 to 11 years.
Yeah, yeah, and far more secure.
Yes.
As well. I mean, there's no question that as the number increased coming through the DMVs, the security of that data is heightened because of the documentation people show during the registration process. Well, shifting just a bit to the other end of the system, which deals with file maintenance. There's been a little controversy in this past year with the Houston decision, and that has spurred a number of states to take a look at how they do their maintenance. And I would note that as far as I have heard that even Ohio doesn't really use Houston much anymore. They've relied pretty heavily on ERIC and other methods for getting good, accurate file maintenance. Elaine, do you have any comments you'd make on how your file maintenance is working?
Well, I think our file maintenance was working before ERIC, but ERIC has made a dramatic difference. So now we're able to reach out to voters that we see that are registered in another state, send them a postcard. We can't just take them off the rolls, but we send them a postcard. Mm-hmm. They sign that they would like to be removed from Delaware rolls. They send it back, and it's dramatically changed what we do. It's just one more tool in the toolbox of things that we do. We still do all the, 2 mailings received back and not voting in 2 elections, that type of thing. But right. ERIC made the biggest difference.
Yeah. Keith, any comments in this arena?
Well, obviously, list maintenance is a very important topic, and you have competing goals. You want to make sure that every eligible voter stays registered and is not affected by the process, but at the same time, you want to make sure that folks that shouldn't be on the list are not on the list. And so it's important to have really good data to match, and the legislature passed a bill back in 2013 to allow us to get more full nines from the Department of Public Safety. And so we went from like 6 million full nines in our file to about 12 million, and our matching is much, much improved. We used to have, whenever we would get a batch of deceased records from Bureau of Vital Statistics, we would have about 35 or 40% weak, strong matches and 60%, 65% weak matches. Now then those numbers are reversed. It's more like 70% strong and 30% weak. And so it gets much better data to the counties so that they can improve their list with good data.
Okay. I'd like to comment or raise some questions both with Elaine and Keith dealing with verification of new voters as they come in. And how your processes work and whether you have run into issues dealing with any of that process of verifying the new voter as they are placed on the file.
Well, since most of our registrations come from DMV, there's a verification process there, and they are certifying citizenship when they sign that signature pad. If someone registers, for instance, online and they have not provided any identification, then the polling list is flagged and they have to provide it at the polling place, or they get to vote a provisional ballot rather than vote on the machine.
In our implementation of the HAVA ID check, what we do is every single voter registration application that comes in, they check, it goes through back to DPS and through there to the Social Security Administration if necessary, to check the last name, the date of birth, to see if they match the number that the voter provided, either the driver's license number or last four of social. If the ID is confirmed in that process, then that's the end of it. If not, then the voter is sent a notice of incomplete, and if they say, no, that's me and that's my number, then they are flagged as an ID voter and they have to provide ID when they vote. Of course, everybody in Texas does, unless you vote by mail, and if you vote by mail, then you're going to have to, and you're flagged an ID voter, you will have to provide a copy of your ID with your mail ballot.
Okay. So online registration in Michigan, we're getting ready to implement that, or pardon, not online, but also election day registration is going to be the first big step. And looking at the interaction of the voter file with that on election day in terms of verifying that that voter, one, has not gone to other locations during that day to register. In Michigan, our election day registration will be in the clerk's office and not in the precincts. So, Elaine, you have a little experience with election day, with changes of address that are of people who are already registered. How does that process work?
We've always updated if they're registered to vote in Delaware and they're just they've changed address, we update right at the polling place. There is a bill now to do election day registration that hasn't passed yet, so I'm waiting to see how we enact that. It would be at the polling place, and we're discussing now putting a caveat on the form they sign that they have not voted in another state in that election cycle.
Yeah, right. Keith, do you have that on your drawing boards?
The legislature is meeting right now, and there are some discussions about a version of same-day registration for folks who are already registered in the state, and so we'll see if that progresses.
Absolutely.
And I just add from the perspective of our ERIC states, we have Minnesota as a member of ERIC, and Minnesota decided to implement the requirement to reach out to eligible but unregistered by doing a monthly mailing. When you join ERIC, you're just really committing to doing that every 2 years prior to the federal general election, but Minnesota opted to do this on a monthly basis, which in some ways really benefits them and their voters because they're reaching out to those individuals closer to the event that causes them to be eligible. But they are also, as we all know, an election day state. And they saw a dramatic decrease in the number of election day registration transactions after they had implemented ERIC. They also had implemented OVR at the same time, so it's hard to tell, to attribute this very significant, over 100,000 transactions fewer after implementing OVR and ERIC. And that's a data point we can jump in and start researching, but that's something that they point to after joining ERIC was a decrease in election day registrations.
Yeah, no question. I think that much of the election day registration will just be people updating that have moved and didn't get that done in the DMV or elsewhere. So with online registration, there's been some indication that maybe some of the third-party registration drives have decreased. Have you seen any of that at all, Elaine?
Yeah, we have in Delaware. There's been a decrease in just paper applications in general. Almost everything that doesn't come from DMV now comes online.
And I think the beauty of election day registration is the safety net that it provides. So out of all of these processes that are ongoing, eventually people are going to get dropped through the cracks. And the election day really provides that safety net to permit them to stay on the file and vote on election day. Any final comments that anyone would like to make before we talk?
Sure. Before we open up for questions, one of the things that I would like to ask of the audience, particularly the academics or the advocacy groups or others out there, is something that I've been seeing over the last few years, and this particularly revolves around the fact that I have small, or not so small children anymore, but the fact that cursive is not taught in schools. And so that what is going to be counted as a signature moving forward. I know that most states require a wet signature when you register to vote for NVRA as well. So as we move forward and you know, we push folks to be more civically minded, you know, if they're just printing something, what are we going to, are we counting that as a signature? Because it's not always going to be, at least for, you know, verification purposes by eye, to say what looks different or what doesn't look different. So, you know, are there studies that are going to be done or so forth as we move forward to see what sort of things we can do to alleviate this?
That's a big issue, and we saw it this past year in Michigan during, not so much on elections, but dealing with petitions. And so it's not so much the lack of a cursive, it's the credit card signature, right? Everybody has a credit card signature now, and that credit card signature does not match your signature. Or if it does, it's a very, very slim match. And we came down with a couple of statewide ballot proposals that filed hundreds, thousands more signatures than necessary, and came down to the random sampling where literally the decision whether to certify or not certify was based on 12 signatures, of which you could look at the regular signature, and there's no connection at all. The petitioners went out and got affidavits from these folks indicating, well, yeah, I did sign it, that's my signature, but it looks nothing like what they would sign on their driver's license or voter registration. So clearly there's a signature issue looming there, one more systemic and one more connected to the way people do business today. Final comments, anybody?
Now, I think the progress we've made in elections over the last 10 years has been pretty dramatic from, like you were saying, from OVR, AVR, ERIC. I always say that ERIC has made the biggest difference in Delaware list maintenance. It's just dramatically changed the way we do business.
Okay.
I would just add that
sure.
We've talked a lot about reforms, a lot of voter registration reforms this panel. We're going to talk about them all day. And I think a lot of those reforms were in response to a problem. Right. And I think it's important going forward that we not just think about how do we solve the problems we see now, but how do we should be thinking about what's coming, what challenges we'll face in the future. We're thinking about the generations that are going to be coming of voting age. What are they, you know, how are they living? What are they interacting with? What are their expectations going to be? Any of you that have kids know they spend a lot of time on screens. They have a demand for sort of instant gratification because that's sort of how their world works. And they're going to be voters soon. And so thinking about what challenges that presents to us in terms of administering elections is important. We shouldn't just be trying to solve yesterday's problem or today's problem. We should be thinking about what innovations do we need to work towards that are going to be better in the future for future voters.
And I think that's a great point. It's that integrated system that's really needed to put it together rather than piecemeal layering it on. At various times in history, we thought, hey, that's problem solved. And here we are still talking about voter registration. I mean, this was sort of a 1960s thing, you know, that really got people going. And then here we are in 2019 still talking about voter registration. So there is a great opportunity to look for some integration of these programs that are out there and look forward to what's around the corner. Well, at this point, we're more than happy to take questions from any of you who would like to ask them. And let's get started. We've got microphones here. Yes.
Hi. Sylvia Albert with All Voting is Local Leadership Conference Education Fund. Thank you for speaking about the way that you guys see registration going forward. I have a question related to rejection rates. Around the country, we see, and if you look at the EVES data, we see high rejection rates of registration applications in certain communities, usually the low-income or minority communities. What ideas or do you guys have for addressing that problem and actually ensuring that all communities are able to register and not have this issue?
Great. Want me to start? Sure. So Dr. Nichelle Williams and David Coonan back there, who work for the Election Assistance Commission, are going to be doing our EVE survey. I think of it as we need to do more, just more in education to ensure that folks know what sort of things they need to do so that the forms are filled out correctly, so that they're not being rejected. I'm happy to sit down and see what other ideas are out there. But I think of it as we move towards online voter registration, it's going to be a little easier to make sure that those aren't being rejected. And with 37 states already doing it, I think that we should be seeing those rates of rejection go down. But I think that we should strive to ensure that those levels are as close to zero as possible.
Anyone else?
Well, I would say it'd be interesting to dive into the data a little bit more and understand why they're being rejected so you can sort of diagnose what the problem is. I think the closer the registrant is to the election official, you're probably less likely to result in a rejection. In other words, if you're registering to vote directly on a Secretary of State's online registration portal, you're less likely to have an incomplete registration. And while there are a lot of organizations that try to play an important role or do play an important role in getting people registered to vote, when those are either paper processes at the county fair, or even if they have a tablet with a unique URL that they're canvassing the neighborhoods with, that's better than paper. But there are other organizations out there with sort of third-party apps, and it's important, I think, for them to partner with election officials to make sure that communication is going both ways, they understand what's involved, that the interface works, the data transmission works, and they're addressing those problems that may result in either rejected or incomplete registrations.
Good, thank you. Questions? Back here.
Hi, Lindsay Daniels with the Democracy Fund. Just two quick questions. Elaine, you had mentioned unintended consequences that were more dramatic even than what you might have thought when you made this switch. I feel like sometimes people think unintended consequences is a negative term. So I was just wondering if you could unpack that a little bit more on what you mean by that. And then for Shane, I was just wondering, you mentioned Minnesota and their process of doing monthly mailings. Do you have a sense of whether or not that is more effective, results in more registrations than other states that might do it in different ways?
Okay, as far as unintended consequences, the first one we had, at the time we implemented, we call it e-signature. At the time we implemented that, we had, statewide, we had 8 vacant positions in our state, and there was a freeze on hiring. It was during the recession. And we never filled those 8 positions because we no longer had paper that had to be filed. There was a system where the paper came from the county offices to the commissioner's office we verified everyone to make sure they did the data entry correctly. There was no longer any data entry happening. It was all happening at DMV. Just clearing out the filing cabinets was dramatic. Then we moved on to scanning in any paper applications that did come in. We also do, we built OVR on top of that, which that wasn't even in our minds when we started it. Literally, when we changed at that point in time, probably in the early 2000s, the governor then had a real initiative for e-government, and we changed one line in the code that said we could accept electronic signature. We didn't even know what electronic signature was going to be. And then we went through this process, and so we didn't have to change any other laws. I see all the states that go to the legislature to try to get something implemented like this. We didn't even ask anybody. We just did it because we had changed that one line in the code. we just didn't see it as a change in anything we were doing, just it was improving the system we used. But because we already were getting so many from DMV, it just changed election day dramatically. We already had the information. We were not looking for applications anymore. So there was not a downside from the first day. I'll tell you one other thing. When we met with DMV, for years we met with DMV, and they were concerned about our idea, one agency doesn't like another agency kind of telling them what to do. They didn't want the election piece of the voter register, or of the whole DMV process to take more than 90 seconds. And they were sure that we were going to slow their lines. And I was sure we couldn't because, well, we had to provide all the, the applications came in triplicate. They had to load the printer. They would have to go back to the printer, get the form, bring it up to the counter. We could not have, it could not have slowed their lines. But so day one, when they went active, we sent somebody over to time how long it took. It was 30 seconds. That was on the first day. They tell me now it's about 15 seconds. So that helped DMV. So it took money out of our budget because we ended up losing 8 positions, and DMV cut down. We didn't have to buy paper. We didn't have to mail out every day the letters that said, we thought you were DMV yesterday, you didn't register, here's the application. Only about half, maybe on a good day, 75% of those came back. But so it just closed all the gaps in the system that were just inherent because it wasn't a DMV problem or an election problem. It was just a bad process, and it corrected everything that was bad.
And Lindsay, the aggregate number that comes to mind for all of our members as of the end of 2018, about 18% of the individuals that were mailed a postcard and given information on how to register to vote were registered voters. We can't attribute that all to the ERIC mailing because there are a lot of other factors that drive people to register to vote. State specific, I don't have the number off the top of my head. I know there's been research throughout ERIC's existence on the effectiveness of the EBU mailings, whether different messages are more effective, whether timing. There's research right now in the field that on the 2018 election that'll probably come out later this year for a few states that participated in that. And in ERIC, we are sort of taking a dive and look into our data, and we're having some discussions about sharing more granular level data, basically state level data, both on the eligible but unregistered, but the other reports. And I look forward to being able to share that with everyone soon, I hope. So to get at your question specifically about Minnesota, I think that's coming.
Okay, Judd. Judd? Yeah.
Judge Ho from Colorado.
Your mic is on.
I wanted to give you some more data on election day registration. So Colorado instituted that in 2013. Amber McReynolds, who's on your a later panel, was instrumental in that legislation. I don't know if she's here in the room. Election day registration, its last election, we registered people through early voting and on election day. Through early voting, we had 90,000 people who either updated their voter registration or registered for the first time then. And then 120,000 people that did it on election day, so that's 210,000 people. That sounds like a big number. It's actually bigger than you can imagine because in our entire election, that election, we had 2,583,000 people vote. That our voting eligible population turnout was 63%, second highest in the country. Without those 210,000 people who would not have been eligible to vote in 2012, our turnout would have been 57.5% and would have been 9th in the country. So voting election day registration is a huge boon for Colorado, and I just think it's an essential element of this advancement in voter reg.
Thank you. Who else? Yeah.
Somebody behind you.
Sort of along those lines of Judd's question, Larry Moore, by the way, from Votes. Has been any studies on the demographics of people who register online? And a second related question is, what do you all see the impact of the advocacy groups like, well, they're not advocacy groups, but activist groups like TurboVote on driving registration?
Comments?
I don't know.
I don't think I'm
Well-
not aware of studies on that.
Yeah,
So
I don't know that we see any difference.
And Judd knows.
Go ahead, Judd knows.
Yeah.
So what we have at the EAC, which staff has given me, is that 3 national non-governmental groups focus on voter registration through online platforms: Rock the Vote, Turbo Vote, and Vote.org. Report to the EAC that they support voter registration for more than 2.2 million individuals using the NVRA form. That's all that we have. So.
And as far as the demographics, every bit of data that I've seen on it shows that it doesn't change. It's not different than the other registration processes. In other words, it's the same number of Republicans, same number of Democrats, same number of women. It doesn't change. It just is a new form of registration. It's not different than other forms. That's right.
I would say that, and this is my own thoughts on it in terms of advocacy groups doing voter registration, it's also a way for them to do membership organization growth. So if I'm registering with AARP for their monthly whatever, then I'm also becoming a member as I'm registering to vote. So.
And it's important for third-party groups to work with the state and make sure that they're in compliance with state laws in order to help the voters. We all want voters to successfully register and successfully vote. And if advocacy groups do not make sure that what they're doing works in their state, then they could end up hurting the very voters they're trying to help.
Okay. Greg?
Yes.
Wait, they were going to bring him up.
Member of Thomas Advisory Board. My question is just about that point with advocacy groups. To the degree that I think I heard the number that so much of the registration going on in Delaware is not paper ballots, paper registrations anymore.
Correct.
Can you give any advice to advocacy groups in terms of their strategies for doing registration? Because obviously it's getting harder and harder to get high numbers with that work. And then second, any thoughts about the direct mail registration that's being done by some groups that basically mail out, third-party mail-outs to all the people who've actually either been taken off the list or been purged from the list? There's a lot of those kind of campaigns where big money is dropped into rather than the hands-on registration. So it'd be great to think if anybody wants to give a thought about the effectiveness of either of those two strategies, either the hands-on going forward or the direct mailers going out to people who've been taken off the list through voter purges.
Well, most of our registrations come just from DMV and online voter registration, so it would be great if advocacy groups push them in that direction. Years ago, we had some issues with third-party doing registrations, and one guy just took everybody out of the phone book and filled out forms and sent them in, and we just happened to catch one and started going through the stack and looking at them, and anyway, somebody ended up being prosecuted. So it's great if any advocacy groups works with the state to, and that happened with that group at that time. We went back to them and they worked with us as far as the prosecution, but then they started creating lists for us so we could tell which one of their people registered somebody, so we could, if we had a question, we could go back and find it. But with so much online and DMV registration today, that's really the fastest and easiest way to do it.
The mass mailouts by groups have an effect on us. Usually they have our office address as the return address for those applications. So we get hundreds and hundreds of thousands of paper applications that we have to sort into 254 buckets and send out to the counties. And so as we get close to the deadline, everybody is sending out their applications. A good number of those applications the voter is already registered. And so it ends up being a whole lot of extra work. Our whole agency has to work overtime. We have a commitment to the counties that we're going to get them turned around and out to them in 48 hours. And so when we get close to the deadline, the whole agency is working on voter registration applications.
Greg, one of the things I would advocate for, and thank you again for being a member of the EAC's advisory board. I think that's very valuable. One of the things I would advocate for is one of the things that we've been doing at the EAC for a number of years now with a partnership with groups like NAS. It's the National Voter Registration Day. so that folks know on that particular day, which I believe was September 27th this past year, that's usually the third or fourth week in September, that folks do a basically nationwide voter registration drive. We did a Facebook Live event at the EAC with from some groups, and I believe that things like that help to show that these are to cut down on some errors and so forth, but also a way to make it more nationwide.
And I think the states that founded ERIC when we were building it had hoped, we were all dealing with those mass mailings at the time, and we had hoped that participation in ERIC would encourage those organizations to focus those mailings in states that weren't participating in ERIC, since ERIC members were going to be doing these postcard mailings. I think we struggle and still do with the accuracy of the data that those organizations use that result in applications being mailed to individuals who no longer live in the state or who are deceased, or even in some cases pets who are used on commercial mailings. So that's a real challenge, I think, for election administrators who had hoped that that would decrease, and it doesn't really sound like it has.
Yes, thank you.
Stacy.
Hi, Stacy Scholl with Democracy Fund. Thank you, panelists. I want to ask about another discrete community. So we've talked a little bit about Uwakava voters, but one thing that the PCA report was helped readers identify the issue of the different treatment of the FPCA within the states. And I just wanted to get a sense, two-part question, a sense whether or not states that do have maybe a slightly different treatment of the FPCA, do you feel like you're getting better at communicating that to voters, creating expectations around their voter registration? And then the second part is for any state using the FPCA and providing that opportunity for this group of voters. Do you feel like this group of voters are getting better about communicating their change in mailing address to your local election officials? And is that education gap closing at all, from your perspective?
Yeah, I do think it has improved, and especially now we get an email address and then we can communicate by email. Delaware developed a long time ago an interface between Uwakava voters that we can send and receive their ballot electronically, and so we have an email address. If we have an issue, we can contact them. So I think the communication has improved the service dramatically.
Yeah, that's what I would say as well. The ability to deliver blank ballots by electronic mail it means that they don't need to update the mailing address, and so we have much better success than we used to have.
I agree with all that.
Yeah. I still remain somewhat perplexed as to how a registration can be treated differently in terms of how one terminates as opposed to the file maintenance process that has to be done for everybody else. I find that pretty incredible, to be frank, that they would be treated in a different fashion, that they can just expire after a certain period of time, as opposed to being a permanent registrant that can be removed under some uniform processes. Yes, here.
Good morning. I'm Nichelle Williams, the Director of Research at the EAC. And my question is, I guess, as motor voter relies heavily on DMV for registration, e-signature, and list maintenance, and the population moves towards car sharing or not using a car at all, what are your thoughts on how we capture folks that do not have vehicles or may never step into a DMV in states without AVR?
Well, I think in Delaware, at least, we use a state ID, and a lot of people that do not drive in Delaware apply for a state ID, and everything we do for people to get a driver's license, we do for those that come in to apply for a state ID. So we treat them the same.
Same in Texas.
I think you'll find that pretty uniform, but I also think the agencies that are registering, that is sort of the next frontier in terms of having the same kind of connectivity with the state files that the DMV files have. I believe there is some states have started moving in that direction, but that I think is next on the frontier in terms of how to integrate all of that into one system.
The DMV is the largest, but it should be other state-run agencies as well. So.
Right. Yes, sir.
Maurice Turner, Center for Democracy and Technology. As a follow-up, how close do you think we are to having the conversation about having a national voter ID card? So this idea that you have an ID card for the thing that you want to do, so you're not trying to use a driver's license to vote, but everyone has a uniform voter ID card that can't be used for anything else. It's just for what you present on election day or when you want to pick up your ballot.
Is that a third rail?
You go ahead, yeah. Step on, please.
Well, I've traveled in this job and previous jobs I've held. I've had the honor of representing the United States and overseas in some different capacities. And most of the nations that I've traveled to have national voter registration cards, which are used for other aspects of it as well. I think that we're a long way from having that here in the States for two reasons: left and right. Neither one of those groups or parts are going to ever agree, or I should say, they're very far from agreeing on national ID cards for various reasons. Both have distrust in the government and what that data is going to be used for moving forward. And so I think of it as if there's something done, then maybe we can do it in a trial basis, basically saying, we're going to give children who are born now, ID cards, and then move that forward so that 100 years from now, then everyone has it. But right now, I think that the left and right are just going to continually fight, and that we're not going to get that sort of even dialogue going. That's just me. So, not speaking for the agency on that.
It'd make our conferences a lot more exciting. Anyone else? A final question? Glad to take it. Yes, sir.
Jerome Lovato, I'm with the Election Assistance Commission. And I was in the city of Kalamazoo in December, and the local city clerk was telling me how the issue they have on election day are these third-party apps that encourage young people to register to vote, but there's fine print in there, which is still go talk to your local election official. And so these young people get this app, they're excited, and they're like, where's my ballot? I voted, or I registered to vote. And then they find out, no, that app's not tied to our system here. Yeah. And so especially for the election administrators, have there been any thoughts about somehow vetting these, and I know it would probably be impossible, but somehow vetting these companies, since there are about 3 or 4 major ones that do this, or providing some kind of outreach or instructions on make sure it's not fine print that you tell them to go and talk to their local election official, but what are the thoughts? Because I know it's not just a challenge in like a college town like Kalamazoo, but across the board. But has there been discussion about how that process can improve?
I think part of the process, I'll speak from Michigan. I think I was at the same meeting you were at with the, I didn't hear the comment, but I was there. Again, it did not have open online registration. And so they were actually registering with one of these groups on their online system, thinking that that was going to be transmitted. And they are not, because that type of online registration doesn't exist. So yeah, I think those groups need to be held accountable for that, and they need to make sure that they're giving fair and clear notice to those folks. And I'll go back to the election day registration now in Michigan is going to be the safety net for people that those types of situations happen. So there will be an ability for them to get registered to vote.
We had a fairly robust discussion of this topic at NASED recently here in the city with some of those groups, and I hope that they came away with an understanding that they need to work with the states in order to have a successful voter registration transaction for the voter, so that the voter doesn't have the impression that they successfully registered and end up surprised unpleasantly on election day.
Okay, well, will you join me in thanking the panelists for their work here? And we will take a 15-minute break.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, guys.
sister. You might research that. Just in case, yes. And I said, how are you? How are you? Yes, I am. So like a contest with the shoes for boots, I should say? Definitely. Yeah, you can't compete with that. That's deliberate, I think, to keep you alive. It's funny, I used to, not phase per se, but birthday from New York. Another phase where I did a lot of shoes. I don't know why, I just got into it. And also I had boots. My one friend's a child in college, he got me, I had boots, and I had to go back to New York. Like Long Island Cowboy or something. I'm in that.
When you're wearing this, I remember that when we in DC, President's Day, it was $2. Is it soft?
No, I really want to see the material, but someone take a picture of it. That'd be a great Facebook moment.
Yeah, there you go.
Those two panels are rubbing each other. Oh, I do. When you did a little starting point, I have a couple of bullet points, but cutting it off with the just settled, still very confidence. But the challenges is going to come later, like the timelines release. That's a separate thing, right? Yeah, that's why I have that line there, because otherwise it's like just
whatever she says. Well, no, this is one of the things where I did so we will all have to and hopefully none.
There'll be good questions.
I don't like that.
My turn to my
Okay.
All right, turn to now.
Then we've got the timer there, so we'll be all set. But then I don't need my phone. I brought my phone up because I was thinking I needed it for that. And they have specific seats that I can't remember. I think it's Adrian and there you go. All right.
John, you're actually in the kitchen.
I'm in the kitchen. I got the sign. You guys tell me what to do.
Live, you said, let me know.
That's right.
I want to get that. All
That's essentially
we need to go there.
See, I call it automated. Voters can choose your party, do all those things that you need to do. Usually I see in your trade vision because everything would be done. Because actually, mailing something is, I don't even respond to it.
It's going to not going to be justified. And the cost of this maintenance is going to go up as expensive as it is. It's going to be reduced. Go there, go there. Very true, very true. And then military voters too move and that's a problem. Actually, my son
All right, I'm the Grim Reaper that gets to end your break here. So if you can come back to your seats, we're gonna start up with the next panel. Okay, so welcome to the second panel of the day. This one on tallying results efficiently. It is my honor to introduce another person who needs no introduction. That is Tammy Patrick. Tammy Patrick, as many of you know, was the federal compliance officer at Maricopa County for many years, was a member of the President's Commission on Election Administration. We had the honor of working with Tammy for a number of years, and now Tammy sits at Democracy Fund. And I will note that we have given Tammy a bit of a disadvantage because we don't have her with her PowerPoint, but she will do a great job moderating this panel. Tammy.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. And those of you out in the hallway, you're missing just the best panel. Don't tell anybody else. And the rest of you who are in panels this afternoon, those will be the best panels of the afternoon. And those of you who are just on a panel, that was the best first panel ever. So welcome. I'm so excited to have what I anticipate is just going to be a little bit of sitting around in the, we'll say, living room with these friends of mine and talking about some really important issues that deal with the elections in our country. So I want to thank BPC and Democracy Fund, both of whom I have worked for and worked with for a number of years now since serving on the PCA. I also want to give a shout out to everyone out in the Twitterverse and watching online. I said I'd give them the little ear tug. And then very briefly, I want to go through and introduce my friends and panelists who are up here with me this morning. Their full bios are, of course, in the folders, so I'm not going to go extensively through it, but just to at least give you some orientation of who we have on the stage with us and what jurisdictions they represent and their perspectives that we'll hope to bring out in this conversation about 2018, kind of what happened and then what we can think of for the future. So next to me here is Brian Corley. He's a supervisor of elections in Pasco County, Florida. Next to him is the county recorder of Maricopa County, Arizona, my former county. Next to Adrian Fontes is Linda Lindberg, and she is the director of elections in Arlington, Virginia. And next to her is the public information officer, Kristen Makrimovitz from Mecklenburg in North Carolina. And bringing up the end of our row here is my former colleague, Don Palmer, who is now a commissioner at the Election Assistance Commission, as well as former state elections director for Virginia and Florida. So as you can see, we have a stellar panel. What I'd like to kind of kick things off with is when we look back at the midterms, it seemed to me like everything that was old was new again. So issues that we've been dealing with for quite some time kind of resurfaced in maybe a new and more interesting way. And then we had some things happen that we've never seen before. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of those experiences. And because I'm a former local election official, everything for me always happens in a chronological fashion. I like to have things very orderly. So the first thing we want to talk about is really in this discussion about tallying efficiently and tallying. Election officials will tell you that the actual tallying and the counting is kind of the last thing that gets done. First and foremost, we have ballots being returned. And so I want to first turn to Kristen to give us a little bit of an insight, because we've all been reading about North Carolina in the news. So give us a little bit of insight about how your life has been for the last few months.
Well, we're not done. 2018 isn't over for us. The hearing actually starts on Monday. So it was rough. I'm not going to lie. 9, we knew from the start would be huge, and it was bigger than we anticipated. For absentee by mail, we had been dropping, so as everyone says, we're data-driven. In our estimation, we thought we might send out 7,000 ballots, which in Mecklenburg, just because we do so much early voting, we sent out over 25,000 ballots. 17,000 were returned in some fashion. So for us, we are still waiting to find out what will happen in one of our congressional races. It is only 20% of our county. So that was rough as well, because of course the whole county couldn't understand why they didn't get to vote on it, since it was nationwide news. And for now, our legislature has decided that we will hold a new election. They've already, even though the hearing hasn't been heard, so as you talk about new things, they have said, oh, let alone we will have a new election, we will have a new primary. They actually set the date for March 25th, which all of us are, wow, okay. So we're waiting to find out what will become of that bill, since it was passed. Where will that go? Our assumption is it will just be ignored, because they will have the hearing and then they'll decide what to do. And obviously, based on federal law, we cannot have it March 25th, as we haven't heard it. So for us, I think that has been the hardest part of 2018, is all the legislation, which started with, many of you know, our districts were thrown out, so people didn't even know whether they were in 9 and 12. They were deemed unconstitutional after the primary, so again, it raised huge interest of, well, why am I voting on this if it's unconstitutional? So even when we finally seat someone, will we still, I mean, again, we will immediately turn around and have new districts. So 18 was rough.
I guess, my word. So I think that raises a number of themes that we're going to see over the course of the next 50 minutes or so. And that is that oftentimes the rules under which an election is being conducted, whether it's a deadline or an eligibility requirement or what you deem as voter intent on a ballot, can vary widely, and it can vary up until the end of, up until Election Day oftentimes. When I was at Maricopa, we had the Purcell principle is something that is a vestige of Helen Purcell, the previous county recorder, and it said that these changes right up until Election Day can dramatically affect the voters' experience and the voters' process, and that can be really problematic. So part of the challenge I think that we had, and we're going to dive into this a little bit later, is how ballots come back. You have a ballot harvesting law on the books.
That's brand new. So that is brand new. So as you're talking, as you're talking about the changes, that actually just went into effect. So previously, anyone could return a ballot as long as we got it the day before the election. The new law states that now it has to be a near relative, and near relative is defined explicitly, and we actually have to keep logs. So let alone you can return the ballot, but I have to have a log of that, either at my early voting site or in my office, of who actually physically returned the ballot. In the case of Bladen County, which is part of this District 9, a gentleman for years has been helping individuals vote. He did not realize, well, I assume he did not realize, he continued to do so. The issue is, are there 900 votes there? So at this time, again, a near relative must return it. And of course, as we look at changes for the future, one thing that I feel we've done wrong in North Carolina is we seem to have a different set of rules for different events, meaning you can return it to early voting, but you can't return it to my office on Election Day. It has to be mailed. You can't return it to an Election Day polling place either. So if you have a spouse or a child that is not well and they vote their ballot, on Election Day, you can't walk in and hand it into a precinct official. It must be mailed. So again, all of these things creates confusion for the actual voter. Plus, again, the harvesting law, which and I'm kind of all over the map here, but as we look at these bills, one thing that's frustrating is they hide these. The bill has 100 different things in it. And this harvesting portion was in a separate bill with numerous other things. So we all knew it existed. It just didn't get communicated to the public as well as it should have.
And that's another unifying theme, is the communication aspect and understanding when things aren't the same from one election to the next and what the rules are and whether or not you can behave in the same way as a voter from one election to the next. And you mentioned dropping off ballots at the polls. So when I was in Maricopa, we would have in a presidential election, 170, 180,000 voters would drop their ballots off at the polling place on election day. It might be bigger in a presidential election, could be more than 200,000 in one county alone. And then you have voters, because voters, like all people, are a bit of procrastinators. I'm one of them. Any procrastinators out there? And they like to see if something's going to happen up until election day to change or to sway how they are going to make their marks. So many people hold them in their possession. And then the question is whether or not, do you mail it back? Do you drop it off? What are your options? Are you living in one of the states like Colorado or Washington where they have a lot of drop boxes, California now with their Voters' Choice Act, or like in Arizona, you could drop it at the polls. So how did that go, Adrian, last year?
It went really well, as a matter of fact. First of all, thanks to BPC and Democracy Fund. And shout out to everyone in the Grand Canyon State. Happy birthday, Arizona, 107 years today.
Right?
We're the Valentine State, among a lot of other names, I think that some we won't go into. 2018, the November general election was really actually pretty good for Maricopa County. I think a lot of the things that folks have to deal with in other parts of the country, bigger and smaller jurisdictions, we see almost all of it. As a lot of people know, Maricopa County has some very big sort of cosmopolitan areas in downtown Phoenix area, all the way down to very, very rural places, some Indian reservations, and things of this nature. So we've got the broad gamut. But when it comes to communicating with voters and getting the word out there, I think it went really well because we got into partnership with Arizona's Clean Elections Commission, with the Secretary of State's office under the prior administration, and the new administration obviously is going to carry that on with all of the election officials around the state. And we had a multi-layered communication strategy that we reached out to voters and we told them the same thing from every pulpit in the state. So we all decided early on, very, very early on, you got to get it in the mail 7 days before Election Day. One unified message, it helped a lot. If you don't get it in the mail, you got to drop it off after that. And we had great partners in the media who, you give everyone in the different media markets the exact same message, you're going to get the exact same message spoken to, and they're going to buy in. So that went really well. As far as the specific administration of it goes, we didn't have anything really unusual happen, but we had an unusual reaction to the results. And that made it interesting because I think, like a lot of us, folks in politics, not in elections, but folks in politics have very, very short memories. And they forget that Maricopa County never reports full results immediately. On Tuesday night, we do all of our earlies, which seems like a lot because we'll be reporting out 600, 700, 800,000 votes. And then you won't see much more until the Thursday after Election Day because we've got so many ballots being dropped off and so many of the earlies that need signature verification and then tabulation. And what ended up happening was we had, for the first time in Arizona's history, we had 2 women candidates from each of the one from each of the major parties running for a very hotly contested United States Senate seat. And the night of the election, it looked like one was winning, but again, we had less than, well, a little more than half of the ballots tabulated at that point, but we've got a whole half of the election still or more to go. And so by the time we ended up at Thursday, there was a shift in who was ahead, because guess what? When you have tight races and you're counting hundreds of thousands of ballots, you might have that happen. And so that really piqued a lot of people's interest. And now they want to know what the final results are, right? Because we've got a horse race. Well, our tabulation system is robust, it's secure, and it's super, super slow. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? Unless you live in the era of Twitter, unless you live in the era of we got to have this information immediately because I've got a headline, I've got to do this, I've got to decide who's going to be on what committees, I got to know what, so the politicians and the media and the public, everybody wants finality, and that's okay, but I want accuracy. And elections professionals, Tammy actually taught me this because you learn from the best. You can there's 3 things out there about elections, but you can only have 2. You can have them really cost effective, some say cheap. You can have them really accurate, and you can have them really fast. But you can only have 2 of those 3. If you want it accurate and fast, it's going to cost you a ton of money. If you want it cost effective and accurate, it's probably not going to cost you a ton of money, but it's not going to be fast. And so on, the formulas go. So this is really important, and it's something that sort of the media culture and the talking heads forget. Our priority is not speed, it's accuracy. Number 1. Number 2, cost effectiveness. So did we have controversy? It was, we'll use the etymology here, certainly contrived. But we didn't have any real major issues in the fall of 2018. Great crew that's been around in Maricopa County for a long time. Tammy was there, a while back and knows all of these people from back then, mostly. So we've done, I think, a pretty good job, and we're on a path to brighter futures, too.
And that's so many good points, particularly close elections. Close elections will do many, many things for many, many people. It will oftentimes demonstrate the procedures that have been in place for a long time. It's always the case that there's a lot to be done after Election Day. There are provisional ballots to be adjudicated. There are signatures to be verified. And that's where you get a lot of pushback when the race is close. So we heard a lot about California as well. California has one of the longest certification periods because they allow voters to cast a ballot out of their own precinct, and then they replicate that ballot onto the appropriate ballot. So it has anything they voted on that they were actually eligible for, it gets replicated. Well, that takes time. It also takes time in California. They allow, if I'm a voter in Orange County, but I happen to be in LA and I drop off my ballot, they will actually allow the counties to transmit ballots back and forth to one another so that if it gets delivered to the wrong place, dropped at the wrong polling place, well, that all takes time. So if we talk about efficiencies, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, let's think about what are we trying to be efficient with and why. So are we trying to be efficient in making sure that a voter has the ability to cast a ballot effectively and we are able to understand what they meant by that mark, which we'll talk about that in a minute. And are we going to do everything we can to make sure that that eligible voter who followed the rules that they thought were in place at the time, maybe they've changed since the last time they voted, that they have their vote counted accordingly. Now, sometimes in those close races, we have situations that occur. And as you're going through, things happen, Brian. So tell us what happened in Florida when the races are close in multiple races and trigger certain statutory activities, we'll call them. Because I hate to say the R word, but I think he's going to say the R word.
The R word. Well, thank you, Tammy, and thank you to the BPC and Democracy Fund. Yeah, in Florida, not exactly low-key, intense scrutiny, which is good. But so we had, history was made. We had not 1, not 2, but 3 statewide recounts. And many of us, if not all of us, are familiar with the Election Day prayer. Let the winners win big. In Florida by at least 0.51% to avoid the R word. My prayers weren't answered, apparently. So we had 3 machine recounts, and it was quite a challenge. And then we had 2 manual recounts, and under very, very tight timelines, which I know we'll get into a little bit later. The system was stress tested like never before, but it held. That's the important thing. And sure, we had several high-profile instances, but in totality, the system really worked. And what was really exciting about it was the irony of the recounts afforded many people to come out and see our process who ordinarily wouldn't. Many had preconceived notions of how the system worked or why someone should be ahead or not ahead, and from campaigns and lawyers and whatnot and partisans. When the dust all settled and they saw our processes and procedures, it was organized, and Adrian eloquently said, accuracy trumps speed any day of the week. They walked away when the dust settled with, I would say, instilled confidence, renewed confidence. Many of them vocalized that. And that was really, these are folks who, hardcore partisans on both sides of the aisle, who walked away saying, wow, I got to tell you, may not still be happy with the results, but I'm very pleased with how things went. It was slow, deliberately, methodical, deliberately, and the only real issue we had was there was some misinformation that was out there, a lot of which was on social media. You know, we hear allegations of quote, found votes in one particular county, and when you had delays in tabulating, particularly it was vote by mail ballots, when the votes were tallied, it buoyed up a certain candidate, and they surpassed the one who had been in the lead. And that doesn't, you know, slowness in tabulating ballots doesn't equate to, quote, found votes. So we had to deal with a lot of misinformation out there. But in totality, the system worked. I mean, never in a million years did we think we'd have one statewide recount, two, but three. So all in all, it was a good process.
We definitely want to come back to the timelines and the deadlines and that sort of thing. And I think you're absolutely right. I think everyone saw the pictures of those found votes that were in a processing plant, in a postal facility. Well, Florida is an in-hand state. It's not a postmarking state. So the supervisors of election are very diligent about being at the processing plant at the deadline and accumulating all their ballots. The Postal Service does sweeps of the processing plants on an hourly basis, looking for not only the election mail logo, but now they have a particular service type ID for ballots as part of that intelligent mail barcode was implemented last year, and it was used in Florida in many of the counties. And so those ballots were not eligible ballots that were seen in those pictures in the day or two after the fact. But there are places and there are times, sometimes when you think you're done with audits and you're done with your canvas, and then what happens, Linda? So I think Linda has a story for us.
Well, not a personal story, but I must say that I was surprised after this election about the number of instances throughout the country where a jurisdiction had certified their election and then later found ballots that hadn't been counted. Maybe it's from a certain early vote machine, or maybe from one of the pieces of equipment within the polling place. And that's something that we feel that, at least in Virginia, we have so many checks and balances in place that it's practically inconceivable. First of all, at the polls on election night, we're making sure that our poll workers give us the poll book count numbers and the number of ballots that have been cast on our voting equipment. When they call that information into us, that's the first check. Do they match, or are they reasonably close to one another? So our staff will review that, and if there's a discrepancy, hey, you told me that there are 400 less votes cast than people who came in through the poll book, you might want to check that. Maybe they missed a piece of equipment. That sometimes happens on election night. But there are many steps in the process where we would catch that information. The next day, or even on election night when we're entering that data into our state system, that's another check. Do they match? The next day when our electoral board is canvassing the election, they're looking at all of those tapes. They're comparing all this. We have this elaborate checklist in my locality where our staff goes through and they say, okay, does the number of votes cast match the number of votes that went through, voters that came through the poll book, and does that match the number of ballots used? That's another component for those of us who are all on paper ballots now. Not so much if you're on strictly electronic machines, but it's key with paper ballots, because does the paper ballots used match the number that have been cast, less any that you've used for provisionals or spoiled ballots. So you have all these checklists in place. And then finally, once we get everything entered into the database, before we say the election's certified, we run a report. We run an error report to make sure that those numbers match up. And I can tell you that with our state Board of Elections, Department of Elections, if we don't run that report and check it before we send the results in, they'll do it for us. So they'll come and tell you, there's something wrong with this one race. You've got more ballots that have been cast than you have people that voted on your poll book numbers. So there are lots and lots of checks. And I think that no matter what type of system you use on election night, whether you take all of the thumb drives and you bring them back to your office and load them into a database, and then you have then you upload them to your state website, you still have to have the human interaction. That is absolutely critical, because it's not just you, it is the political people are watching you. Everybody's watching to make sure that everything is as it should be, or as it is expected to be.
And that's another critical point is we talk about post-election audits, pre-election testing of voting equipment in our systems, and then post-election audits can take a variety of forms. You can have reconciliation audits like what Linda is mentioning, where you're making sure that the number of people that walked through the door or came through the door are the same number that checked in, the same number of ballots that were cast. And then we have other types of audits that are occurring, and they're validating and verifying, did the voting equipment work sufficiently? Is it a risk limiting audit that we're verifying and validating that the correct winner was selected? So in all of those cases, states that do those types of audits, some do it before certification and correct the errors. They're not adding any new votes. These voters voted on election day or during the eligible period, but they're finding the mistakes in the accumulation of these totals. However, some states do those types of audits after certification, and then you have to do an amendment. So that's another kind of element when you're thinking about this in a critical way, as you're hearing different reports, to really kind of dive a little bit deeper into the weeds, which is where I personally like to wallow. And so now I'd like to hear, Don, from your perspective. So last year, you did a lot of work on the national stage. Thread this needle for us. Put it all into perspective.
Well, being in the bleachers, observing the process, I was amazed as the returns started to come in on election night that over the next couple of days, the canvassing became a very key part, because we were in a pre-recount phase, the big R word. We were in a pre-recount phase, and a lot of what we've heard here, there actually didn't turn out to be a recount. So there's ballot counting going on, but there's also this reconciliation process, canvassing process, where it gives the opportunity for election officials to identify errors and to sort of identify those early on and provide that to the public. Because by this point, the press, the political campaigns are intensely focused on these races, because these are races that they're very, very keyed on. They're preparing for recounts. They're preparing to want to make sure that signatures for absentee ballots, for example, are cured, or if there's an omission of an absentee ballot, they're reaching out to voters to get those ballots cured. So this is a process the political parties are very, very keyed in on. This canvassing period, I think, for at least the 4 states, Florida, North Carolina, where they identified potential fraud, and Arizona and California, this process sort of allowed the identification of errors. And I think, just observing the process, particularly in Florida, transparency is extremely key. And I think we really solved some of the issues in Virginia, because we had a very, very close statewide race, Attorney General, and it was going to go to a recount. It looked like it was going to go to a recount. One candidate
started the recount.
One candidate was up, one candidate was down. There were some changes that came with the canvass, but we really were able to deflect criticism, because they saw the state had, it started out as basically a spreadsheet. Right. What were the changes in each locality and why? And that's why we were all over it. Exactly. But that was we got a lot of praise for that, because it's like, look, in the political parties, because they were to say, look, okay, we see the changes and why, because that canvassing process identifies these issues. If a ballot total doesn't look right, or if there's some sort of irregularity, and it resolves that problem before the campaigns start launching lawsuits. That's very key. And so that was my perspective, is just watching that process as, my colleagues from Virginia and Florida went through that canvassing process under strict, it's sort of very tight deadlines to try to get that out to the public and to the campaigns.
So there are a couple of interesting points here as well as we talk about tallying and the canvas, but also election results reporting. The PCA, 5 years ago, we talked about the impending voting system crisis with voting equipment aging across the country, and everyone was like, okay, we're hopeful we'll get it through the midterms. Now we're looking at the presidential, and some states have been able to replace their voting equipment. Others have their fingers crossed that they'll get some appropriation of funds to be able to do that. So I want to start back with you, Don, and then we'll come down. When we're looking to the future of voting systems, so we have the new voluntary voting system guidelines that have been in the works for the last couple of years with public working groups, and they incorporate things like common data formats for election results reporting and other things to increase the interoperability of the voting systems that we are able to use. Can you give us an update on kind of where we're at with the VVSG, and as we look towards the future, what kind of timeline are we thinking?
Well, we just got briefings on that, obviously. I think that 2.0, VVSG 2.0, has a chance to really revolutionize how we as a community, we set standards and how we set requirements for the testing of new equipment. I think it's going to provide an agility that the EAC in the past may not have had. Sort of similar, I appreciated some of the agility we were able to have at state certification level. So I'm hopeful that over the next couple months we have a comment period, and we also have some hearings with TGDC, and we basically are able to look at not only the standards but the requirements, and because the key is that we do have a voting technology crisis, and we want to make sure that the most secure and accurate voting systems are out there for all types of issues, usability, security, and to get that market moving, it requires that we work as a community to get these the new standards out and work with the vendors to start producing equipment to those standards.
I think that's a relief for many election officials across the country. And when we talk about that tension between security and accessibility, and when it comes to vote tallying, I know, Kristen, you had mentioned with a lot of use of direct recording equipment in your state, there's a real push now for hand-marked paper ballots. Emphasis on the hand-marked. And when you introduce hand-marking of paper ballots, of course, we can have a 5-hour conversation about voter intent standards and what exactly does this mean versus that. But if you could just talk a little bit about your experience with some of the benefits or the disadvantages to either of those things.
Well, so we are spoiled, in my opinion. The rest of the country doesn't agree with me. We are currently using a direct record, the ES&S iVotronic, and we love it. We're a banking community. It's going to be very hard for us. We are tasked with, we are supposed to buy new voting equipment, but to your point, our state has certified, nothing. So I am supposed to have something new by March, and we have nothing to purchase except items that I could have bought in 2006 when I bought my iVotronic. But to the iVotronic itself, what we love about it is as we talk voter intent, it always makes me sad because why would I want my 5-member board to have to make a decision on what a voter did? Why wouldn't I want the voter to actually complete the ballot properly, which I know is impossible, but if you have a ballot marking device, such as my direct record, they can't overvote, they can't undervote. The OVA will be perfectly filled in. So for us, as we look forward, we love the idea of being able to put a ballot into a machine that will completely, perfectly fill out the ballot for them with their choices, though, so that way it will be counted as they wanted it to be counted, and as our machines can see that count. Because, of course, they'll say, when they circle it or they spill their coffee or their children color on it, people don't realize that all of that will affect how it's cast.
And you mentioned those things as though they are anomalies, and while the weird markings on ballots can seem rather rare, they happen more often than anyone would like or that you would possibly imagine. So if none of you have ever participated in observing the tallying of live ballots, you should definitely participate because it will open your eyes to how important voter education and streamlining the process and that interface so that voters have the ability to mark their ballots appropriately. Absolutely.
Right. And I wanted to add one thing on that is, so I know that there's also been, everyone has talked the recount word. I know that for us, people say, well, that's not a recount. And I understand that with dairy. Obviously, I'm going to get the exact same one. But that's because we did all the prep work first. So as on paper, they may change just what we're talking about, because the first time through, it didn't count the vote, but the second time through, our board's now going to look at that, which if the spread was large enough, we're not going to worry about that. We're not going to take the time. So those are things, too, that as we look forward, that's where a ballot marking device is nice. We won't have these changes. And again, in my opinion, when you vote on paper, it's very likely we feel like we hit the lottery when our results don't change on our absentees. But a lot of times they do fluctuate 1 and 2 votes here and there in any race based on how the ballot was completed.
Right. So the rest of you, do you have, I can see everyone's just kind of sitting in their seat like this, like, oh, I got something to say on that. Who wants to go next? Adrian?
I'll jump in. So Maricopa County uses a legacy system we purchased in 1996, and the tabulation and scanning technology is circa, I want to say, the Truman administration. It's very robust. It's very secure. It does the job really, really well. It's just a little slow. And one of the important things is this idea of, very important thing is the idea of voter intent. And so, you know, we can get a little jargony up here with this, so I'll kind of break it down. Our ballots right now, and we're looking at a new system right now, so there's a lot of different things happening, but as it existed in 2018, we're one of those not fill in the bubble, but kind of connect the arrow sorts of the optical scan technologies. And if there's an overvote, if you voted for too many, like a vote for no more than 2 or a vote for no more than like 10, our Central Arizona Water District, the water board, yeah. We do vote for a water board in Central Arizona, so it is important. It's a little weird, but it's good. So the idea that human beings are to sit either in front of what is now a scanned ballot, once it got kicked out in the overstack or so forth, to determine the voter's intent, I don't think is that odd, and I don't think it's that problematic, and here's why. I liken it to a jury determining guilt or innocence. It's a question of fact. And we as citizens in this democracy, I think, have a part to play in the democracy overall. And where you have individuals making a determination, are you going to get to the absolute truth every single time? You can't. And I don't know that shuffling that off onto technology for the sake of technology helps much. It can help, and I don't disagree with using it. But I think conceptually speaking, if you have individuals of differing political parties coming to a consensus and an agreement on that vote, on that contest, on that one ballot, that's a good thing. And that is a good humanizing part of our elections. And I think in one way we get sometimes too technical and sometimes too far away from sort of the red blood of America. And I don't want to sound too romantic here, because it's a lot of really hard work.
It
is Valentine's Day, so
it's okay.
but we really, I think, you know, so to put a couple of citizens in charge of helping make that determination and helping try to interpret the voter's intent is not a bad thing. And it doesn't, I don't think, injure the process. Frankly, we had more than 850 board workers come in after Election Day to help look at ballots that the machines had kicked out because of an outstack issue, and they helped decide the voter's intent. And these are differing political parties and folks who, actually, funny story, my mom, hi Mom, was actually one of them, and she was sitting with a person who was very much of a different political persuasion, let's say. And it was pretty obvious. And they worked well together for hours and hours and hours at a time, because they were coming together to do the right thing for the voter, or at least make that interpretive call. And I don't think that's bad. So we have a ton of it going on. We had to do, I think, 167,000 ballots that ended up getting duplicated to run them back through the tabulators. But I don't know that it's entirely a bad thing to have human beings, American citizens, involved in these processes.
And oftentimes, I would say, oftentimes those are in fact hand-marked paper ballots that are having to be replicated, or UOCAVA and military and overseas voters' ballots that have to be replicated. So, Brian.
I was going to say both Kristen and Adrian make great points. When I first started, I ran one election using DREs, and it was nice in the sense of, the results are what they are. In Florida, we had a situation where a losing candidate questioned the accuracy of the DREs, and so the legislature transitioned us to mark sense ballots. First time out of the box we used them, we had a recount. And it was nice to go back to the paper. Although voter intent, Florida has a rather large, voluminous rule.
Yo.
Sorry.
I drafted that, so be careful.
Waited all these years to tell you. No, I'm just kidding. You almost had every possible scenario, but it's impossible to have every possible scenario. My favorite was I got a vote by mail ballot or absentee ballot back one time, and the individual had X'd through who they didn't want and filled in the oval for somebody else. And over on the one side of the ballot where it's not looking for anything, they literally wrote, Mr. Corley, I do not want candidate A. I can't stand them. They are evil. I want candidate B. That's clear voter intent right there. But in this
Are you
last,
sure?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I was pretty comfortable with it. But this last go around, we would have individuals on the same ballot where you would have the oval, the name, and they would say REP or DEM, for example. On the same ballot, they would scribble in over the REP or the DEM. So trying to determine, is that a clear vote intent for the Republican or the Democrat, or is that an anti, the fact they're crossing out? Then they would check mark by name, and they'd also circle on the same ballot. So sometimes there's a clear lack of consistency, but trying to get inside what that voter meant is challenging. But having gone through it, I lean on what Adrian said. Sorry, Kristen. In that it's a good process. The transparency was huge.
It may be good, but the best process is to have the voter. Well, no, to have the voter. I'm not saying DRE is right, but the best process is to have the voter, which I know, pie in the sky, actually complete the ballot accurately to their intent, which is what all of us up here want, truthfully.
Yeah,
we don't want the circles and the crossed out and the check marks. We want, and again, I think 90% of them, they would consistently use a check mark or they would consistently circle. So voter intent would be easy. It's going to be the exceptions where, just like you said, they checked this one, but then they circled this one and they crossed out that one. So what am I guessing at? How do I know intent?
So I totally agree. I'm sorry to jump in here, but we're working in an environment where we not only are looking back to 2018, but we got to look to tomorrow. Correct. And I read something somewhere not too long ago. I'm sure Amber can fill us in on this later. By 2024, 50% of Americans are going to be voting with a ballot they received in the mail. So they won't have an opportunity to go to a ballot marking device because of the convenience factor, because of the security factors and so forth. So we're going to have to figure out a great way and lean on our own citizens to do these jobs of interpretation where we don't educate our voters as well as we ought to. So
correct.
Yeah.
But I also live in North Carolina where it doesn't matter. We will not be mailing out a ballot to everyone by 2024. I can guarantee you that.
We won't be doing it either. But
so it may happen to us, but it will not be 2024.
To Adrian's point, I also agree. You're never going to run away from that for your by-mail people. Even as by-mail ballots increase, absentee voting increases, you're always going to have to make some form of voter intent. And in Virginia, we have a very strict, I won't say strict, but very extensive guidelines on what actually constitutes a marked ballot.
Was that before or after the election in Virginia? Or no, where was it?
That was well before. So well before the 2017 election.
Right. I guess that's my point is that became national news because even though you have a strict guideline, they still had to take it all the way to court to determine how did they decide to vote it.
But one can argue whether or not that was the right move for them to do at the time, is to take it to the court. And what she's talking about, if you don't recall, is in 2017, we had one House of Delegates race that was decided by one vote. And there were, the voter had marked one and sort of scribbled it out and marked another. And in this case, the two parties, we're talking about the two parties that are supposed to mutually decide whether or not that vote should be counted, they could not agree. So Virginia law says that goes to the court. The court decided that to choose one candidate over the other, which resulted in a tie, and then the winner had to be chosen from a bowl.
So in all of this kind of boils down to your rules of engagement, right? The rules of the road. So my understanding of that particular instance also was that as the boards are processing, they're adjudicating, this is the voter's intent, this is the voter's intent. And then at the end, when things start to come together and you see that, oh my gosh, this is a really close race, they started revisiting previous determinations.
Right, because it had been determined one way, and then it's then back the other way.
So that's where you need to make sure that the rules of engagement, when we're talking about tallying and all of this, is that you need to make sure that things can't change depending on the outcome of it. And I think it also ties in so perfectly to how important good voter instructions are and how critical it is that statutory language doesn't prescribe how a ballot is laid out, what the text looks like. Saying that things are all in capitals on the ballot is insanity. We know, of course, from the field guides from Center for Civic Design that that is the worst possible way to have your ballots laid out. And I also think that it's important to note that having a ballot marking device, a hand-marked paper ballot, is very difficult for many of our voters. And as our voting population continues to age, it's going to continue to be a challenge. So offering assistive devices that allow people to vote independently and privately is, of course, really, really critical. So let's talk a little bit about some of the other challenges with some of these deadlines that we see, whether it's in regards to when ballots can come back, whether they're postmarked, not postmarked, when you have to do a recount, when you have to have your audits, and some of those things. I know, Brian, you've been thinking a lot about this.
So we're at a crossroads because we're seeing vote by mail just exponentially increase in utilization. Voters like it, the convenience. So in Florida, it has to be back to our office no later than 7 p.m. on election day. And due to some litigation because of the recounts, we had to provide to the court an analysis. And we found 60% of those that were received after election day were postmarked the day before and the day of the election. So a voter put it in their mailbox on election day at noon and somehow thought it was going to get to her office by 7 p.m. So there's the theory, but empirical. Theoretically, I know I speak for, well, some of my colleagues, have no issue with it being postmarked. If it helps the voter, I'm all for it. But empirically, it would involve the legislature pushing back some of those deadlines, for example, because they like to seat the members of the legislature really, really fast. And that just is certainly not feasible. And when we have, you know, most of our jurisdictions, our states are diverse. And I know Florida, you know, Miami-Dade, 1.4 million voters. What Miami-Dade's needs are is not the same as what Pasco County needs. We have some counties where, you know, I have precincts larger than their entire county jurisdiction. So they can, you know, they can do their provisional on election night because they know the person. They literally know, you know, there's Jim, we've known Jim Bob, sure, we've known him for years, let's count that one, it's all good. You can't do that in large counties. So I know back in 2012, Miami-Dade has 3 languages on their ballot, 65,000 ballots dropped off the day before and the day of the election, and I believe they were 8 to 10 pages each. That is a lot of paper to process. It goes back to the immediacy. You know, I know if by 7:30 we don't have at least 70% of our precincts in, the media's calling me, like, is there a problem? I was like, really? And heaven to Bitsy, when the ballots are dropped off at another part of our county at 7 o'clock and they're couriered over and they see the numbers change, well, because it's we call it the late run vote by mail, it goes back to, we have to have it now, we have to have the story to write or whatever. So I think we'd be okay philosophically with pushing back some of those things, but it would require statutory changes as well that would have to go hand in hand.
Well, there's certainly this kind of tradition of the number of or percentage of precincts reporting. As you move to things like vote centers, as locations move to more ballots being mailed out and dropped off in drop boxes or dropped off at the polls, the reporting aspect of tallying efficiently changes dramatically, because not all jurisdictions, not all states will say all of our early ballots are going to be called this one precinct. And then we know that for our on-the-ground precincts around the jurisdiction, we have 80% of them in. Well, if they're keeping all of the vote by mail or those early ballots are still in precinct mode, at the close of the polls an hour later, you can have 100% reporting and not have one physical ballot or one physical report back from the on the ground of the day of reports, results. And so I think that there's a challenge also. So how do we set the right expectation with our voters? How do we make sure that that urban myth that we're not counting things unless it's close and it changes the election, how do we change that narrative? Because that is something that we hear, every election. I'm sure all of you have heard it.
Well, and one thing I want to add to that is I think the hardest part about that is the challenge for everyone up here is we're all different. So the nightmare for all of us, especially as you're looking at larger, the moves and then being larger, is that since our rules are different, I can accept afterwards, he cannot. So all day long we get, well, in Florida or in Virginia or here, and unless we do standardize at the federal level, it's still going to be very hard to get the information out because each state is allowed to have a different set of rules. So, and also in North Carolina, we are very spoiled. I can start not counting, but processing my absentees weeks before Election Day. So that frees us up on Election Day so that truly at 7:30, I show the results for everything that has come in up through Election Day. So I have a very small number after the fact, which is going to lessen the load of, it gives a lower chance of the actual race changing because you have so few that you'll count after the fact.
Which is an excellent point. So others, I think, all up here have that same sort of flexibility in that you can start to count, but you don't, of course, accumulate totals, that sort of thing. Anyone have thoughts on that particular angle? Does it work well?
It's been a lifesaver for us because being in the DC area, Arlington, Virginia, right across the river, we have a large number of UOCAVA voters, and most of our UOCAVA voters in this area are not military, but overseas citizens, because we have so many people who work for the State Department and USAID and other government contractors. We get the ballots by email. We send them out by email, but we are still required under our state law to receive them back in paper format, which we must hand count. So we're talking thousands of ballots that need to be counted by the close of polls or on Election Day. Since the law changed a couple of years ago, which allowed us to do this pre-processing, where we accept the ballot and not insert it into the processor, well, for the regular ballots by mail, we insert them into the processor. That has allowed us to spend more time on Election Day on these hand counts, which we can also start counting before 7 o'clock on election night. Another law change really, really helped us. So now we're not, our absentee precinct isn't working until the wee hours of the morning anymore, even in a presidential election.
And so there are other hand count ballots. I'm not sure if you were going there with write-in candidates. So many states and jurisdictions also have the ability to file and run as an official write-in candidate, and those are additional processes that have to happen after the close of the polls, but before your official canvass, and it's a hand count process, and it can mean tens of thousands of ballots that have to go through, and some count all the Goofies, the Mickey Mouses, and the Donald Ducks, which is the predominance, but you still have to look at every single one manually.
We're seeing more Spider-Man and Captain America.
Really? Marvel has made an impact.
Yeah, Marvel's made a little bit
The Marvel universe is taking over.
I'm waiting for Emperor Palpatine to start getting votes. But
and I think in today's world, people don't realize that that is a manual count. So for all of us that have older equipment, there is no button I can push. I know the total number, but there is no button I can push. My scanner is not reading what you wrote. I have to manually look at each one. Hence, again, why we love our DREs. Because they type it in, and I can dump it into Excel and sort it and actually count it. So just saying.
The point I was going to make is really sort of takes this to, you know, from we're on the ground talking about the conversation to what exactly is it that we're talking about. So allow me about 30 seconds here. What is a precinct and what does it really mean? What's the utility anymore when we have the kinds of technologies that we can use? So we're tied into a structure politically, right? And I mean politically as the body politic, not partisan politics. We're tied into a structure that subdivides a county into some administratively manageable political subdivision that we call a precinct. Why do we still use that? It is the foundation for this part of the conversation. What is, and I'm not saying it's bad, but my question is really this. Maricopa County, in certain circumstances, can run up to about 15,000 or more ballot styles. Because we have, you know, our partisan primaries and things of this nature. We've got a lot of political parties. So in a precinct, I mean, the real reason is so that the administrator can print the ballots appropriate for those specific voters so they can go on election day, get the ballot they're only eligible for, and cast the ballot. That's why we have precincts. But 84% of my turnout is what I'm mailing out to folks. So to those voters, the idea of precinct, insofar as election administration is concerned, is really irrelevant. And so what we end up with in Maricopa County is this idea where I've got, you know, 400,000, 500,000, 600,000 early ballots that come in. We announce those results at 8 p.m. on election day. Polls close at 7. The statute says an hour later, okay, 8 o'clock, we give those results. Then as the evening goes through, we get to 8% of our precincts reporting, right? 32% of our precincts reporting, up to 100% of our precincts reporting. That's great, but those are only that 15, 16% of the voters that are showing up on election day. That doesn't count the other 200,000 or 300,000 who dropped their ballot off on election day because they received it in the mail. And so this idea that we're still married to, that we take for granted as a necessity, is confusing things. So really the question in my mind is this, and this is really sort of a big, huge existential question, does a precinct really mean what it used to mean? And does it still have the administrative utility? Or because of our evolving infrastructure and because people are moving in different directions in the way we administer elections, is it more of a hindrance that we're leaning on this artifact? And I'm not saying good, bad, or indifferent. I'm not making a judgment call here. But what I am saying is when we look at how it is that we communicate to voters, how it is we communicate with the media so that folks can understand what we do, we have to recognize what these things are in and of themselves. Because I can report out a number, and then I can get to 100% by 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning of my precincts reporting, and then I've got 627,000 more ballots that I've got to tabulate. That does not raise the level of confidence because the storytelling, the narrative seems inconsistent. Why do I still have to be married to that? So it's just a thought on that.
No, I think it's a good point as we talk about the efficiency of tallying and counting, and we think about as well the integrity of the process. So when my favorite when I was in Maricopa is we had the Surprise precinct, and out in Surprise, they had 28 different ballot styles in a primary election. Now, at the time I was doing poll worker training, and I am certain that every single poll worker, they call them board workers in Arizona, paid attention in every single class, none of them fell asleep, and I'm sure, with my fingers crossed, that they provided the correct ballot of the 28 laid out, a big 19-inch ballot. You've seen polling places. How many of you have been poll workers? Nothing gets shuffled around incorrectly when you've got all these different colors and all these different things. So it comes back to the integrity of the process, and not only as rudimentary as voters getting the right ballot because a poll worker is handing them the correct one, but that their records correctly reflect where they live. And that's where we have so many jurisdictions. Maricopa County was one of the first, along with the state of Utah, to move to a GIS, a geo-enabled election process. And that's one of the efforts that at Democracy Fund Voice, we've partnered with NISJIC, which is yet another acronym that it's the GIS departments in the states, to work on just that. How do we get us to that level where we're working off of X and Y coordinates, longitude and latitudinal, so that we don't have challenges with district lines voters being in the wrong place for 40 years in, is it Slovenia, or I'm going to mispronounce it, but yes. So,
Pennsylvania.
yeah, all sorts of places. So with that, our time is up for this portion of it. We'll open it up to questions unless anyone wanted to have just one last comment, or should we throw it to the floor? All caution to the wind.
Just say,
yes.
We found common ground, because I think that I totally agree with you. There, in today's world, our biggest struggle is communication, and the voters do not understand the concept of having to show up at a certain place. Right. And what would be amazing is if we could all get to our, like for us in North Carolina, what has solved that for us is early voting. You can show up anywhere, we can update your address, we can give you the proper ballot, and we can get you out the door. And that, again, for me, so our goal is always customer service. And I know in the first group, I felt the same way. The problem is, how do we get there, especially when we have limited funds? Because ultimately, we all want the voters registered properly, and we want them voting the correct ballot. So
exactly, and I think it's just that. It's following your voters' preferences in your state, where out west, people prefer to get their ballot by mail, except for in Nevada, where they prefer to go in person early, and I attribute that all to Larry. It's all Larry's fault or success, whatever you may be. And then you have some states like Florida, where it's almost divided into three statewide of people who like to go early in person, yep. And this is Charles's data that I use, the snow globe of elections. This is where we take our drink of water. Yeah.
I think Adrian just broke a world record. I never thought I'd heard the phrase existential used with elections administration, but you're spot on. Really, you know, it was like a light bulb moment for me. You know, I think as all of us here in attendance and those watching, we get caught up in the minutia of the process, the procedures, the laws. But I like what you said. I think all of us in the elections community need to really, really take it to a higher global perspective and ask those hard questions. You know, like why is it a precinct? Why not look at vote centers or complete vote by mail states? We need to ask those hard probing questions. I know we tend to get kind of bogged down in the minutia, and I think we need to maybe take a little bit higher global perspective. So,
on that note, on the topic of hard questions, who's got the first softball for us?
Sorry.
That's okay.
Sylvia Albert at All Voting is Local. So as we talk about moving more towards, 2050, half of Americans will use absentee balloting. Then we're not only talking about voter intent, but we are getting to signature match. And that opens up a whole other gigantic problem, as Christopher was saying in the earlier panel. We all have the credit card signatures as opposed to our regular signature, and then children aren't even learning cursive, so they're not going to know how to sign their name. So, and then in terms of, as Adrian was saying, fast, right? It's not fast for somebody to sit down and compare signatures, not the least of which they're not a professional signature matcher, blah, blah, blah. So what do you guys see as the future of verifying the voter as opposed to signature match? Because as we go in that way, it doesn't seem like that is the most efficient way forward.
Well, in North Carolina, we don't do signature verification, just so everyone knows. We don't Absolutely do not do it. We have 2 witnesses, so you must get 2 people to witness it. So I don't care what your signature looks like, because in theory, you have got 2 other people that have given their name and their address. And then the process is supposed to be, which hence why we're national news now, if you have a problem, if anyone does not believe that that person filled out that ballot, you have until 5 o'clock election day to challenge that ballot. And we post lists, and in Mecklenburg County, it is on our website, the list of those who voted. So if you feel that that person didn't vote, you have until 5 o'clock to challenge that. So we do not use signature verification. I don't care what the signature looks like. I have to have 2 witnesses or notary, and then it's on them because they stood before that person as they cast their ballot.
So some states do use a witness, like Virginia, but there's also ways, because the signature is becoming, sort of a little bit obsolete, is to use the last 4, some identifying number to sort of match that person, confirm that identity with a sort of identification number, some sort of number that's assigned to the individual. And hopefully there's future technology that will sort of streamline that process, where you can take care of that identity ID confirmation on the front end. So I think that we are, I mean, I think we will be moving away from signature, and I personally think that the identification number that the individual can provide can then be sort of compared with other databases that are available to election administrators.
Yeah, and I take an opposite view. I don't think there's anything wrong with doing the signature verification, and I'll challenge the presupposition in your question that the folks who do this are not professional. The folks in the Maricopa County Recorder's Office and in clerk's offices across the country that do this are doing it consistently. They've been doing it for years and years, and they do get paid to do the job. Not only that, but our training comes from the same people that do the forensic training for the FBI. And it's not slow. It takes a long time because we've got over 1 million people sending us their signatures. So when you're looking at the volume of it, sure, if you're verifying signatures for millions and millions of ballots, it's going to take a little bit of time, but that doesn't mean that it's slow. I also think that the idea that we're not going to go with an affidavit on an envelope with a signature when we would do that for all of the other transactions that we use. And by the way, IEEE does recognize, and so does the banking industry and just about everybody else that does anything formal and official that has to do with money, and our business folks aren't going to just let stuff go willy-nilly. I think signature verification is phenomenally successful, and it has been for a very, very long time. It's enabled a lot of folks to vote in the privacy of their own home conveniently, and we can verify those. We can make sure that that happens well. The recent concerns with signature verification, I think, don't match up to the history of what voters want to do and how voters want to vote. And what are the alternatives? I don't know. I don't have a solution because I don't think that there's a problem. I think signature verification has been very successful. It will continue to be very successful. It will continue to be utilized more and more. By the way, when you walk up to a polling place and you sign off on those voter rolls, when you're not using voter ID, you're doing the exact same thing. So why is it different if you send it to us in the mail or if you bring it and drop it off? Because we're still going to go back and we're still going to verify that signature off of the old-fashioned voter roll / paper registration form. So this is a new concern, and I think it's a novel approach to getting more people involved in the one person, one vote equation. And when you get more people involved, it gets harder for voters. And I'm not a fan of that.
Yeah, and states, I think, have approached this, this concern and this question a variety of ways. So some states allow for banking industry software to do the voter verification match. Some, they don't look at the signature at all because they have witnesses. Some, if there's anything in that box, they say you've signed it. Others, and I think this is where it's really important, is that when you're using signature verification, that there are really rigorous trainings that go through. And it's not that you have to be able to read the signature. Anyone who knows me knows you can't read my handwriting at all. I'm reminded on a daily basis. Nor can you read my signature. It's that you're looking to see consistency in slant, in slope, in line orientation. So having that kind of training can be very helpful because you're just looking for consistency. And the programs like in Maricopa and others, where they pull up all of your signatures that you've had, and knowing that at 25 is about the age when signatures hit a maturation point, and then they start to denigrate as a person gets older, usually around 65 or 70. So there's different ways in which we can do this, and Minnesota is one of the states where after one of those dreaded R words for a very high-profile race, they did away with signature verification and went to the use of the driver's license software. But then the last piece of this is auditing. So if in fact you are having staff and others auditing signature verifications, knowing what is the average or what is the point in time where people can do so many before they need a break, knowing the processing of about how many are really rejected and what is that average rate, and is there someone who's rejecting more than the person sitting next to them. So having auditing protocols in place as well are really important.
One quick add on to that. In Florida, took a step further. We have training actually for our staff, and when Don was there at the Division of Elections, we have a canvassing board workshop. So having seen it with my own eyes, I can tell you, you really can see it. It really is there, and the tie goes to the voter. If we can see, you know, John Smith, the J and the S, you know, we realize people get older. Education is the key. We work on getting voters. We reach out to voters. We go back 5 years. If you've not updated your signature, we reach out to you. But in Florida, you have the curing opportunity. Personally was up in Tallahassee lobbying the legislature. We would have individuals who would request to vote by mail ballot and complete it, put a stamp on it, send it back, just totally forget to sign it, completely blank. Human error. And we did some queries on it. It ended up being the average age was like 65, so it was just human error. So we had law change where you could sign an affidavit and say, it's me, oopsie doozy, forgot to sign it, it's all good. And now we do the same with a signature mismatch. I know in my county, there are 3 levels of auditing before it goes to the county canvassing board for acceptance or rejection. So 3 chances for someone to say, nope, I see it, it's in the count pile. The exact first time that it's not there, if you will, we are to immediately notify the voter. And we had 103 voters this last general election who we reached out to, email, we phone called. We found them on Facebook Messenger and told them all you have to do is send in this cure affidavit and I can 100% guarantee you your vote by mail ballot will be tabulated. 103 individuals, not one of them returned the affidavit, not one. We gave them the golden path and they still didn't even get back to us. We spoke to them on the phone and just said, no, I'm not interested.
And on that, because I think there's a security aspect to all of this as well, is if you're reaching out to those individuals, did any of them respond back to you and say, I didn't vote my vote ballot, that wasn't me?
Oh, no.
Right. So I think that that's another piece of all of this, is that it's yet another check that if you do have signatures that don't match and you allow voters to both cure it, but also it's part of a security measure. Yep. Linda, did you have something you wanted to add to that?
No, just like North Carolina, we do not verify signatures either. And even with petitions, we give the benefit of the doubt to the voter if we can find the registered voter on our registration list.
I love that. Tie goes to the voter. Totally stealing that one. Okay. Any other questions from the room? Yes, over here. Whoops.
Just for curiosity, because since the sorting of voters into very dense blue or red districts, do all your jurisdictions follow exactly the same procedures for primaries versus general elections?
Oh, heavens no, I'm going to say, for the most part. So if I understand the question correctly, and maybe the board interpreted it differently, the panel, the states that are up here, the vast majority of them have I think probably some differing perspectives as far as how you have your primaries for president. So you've got presidential preference primary versus a regular primary. In some states you have an open primary, like in Arizona, where if you're unaffiliated, you can go in and select your ballot in the primary. Others are closed primaries where you have to be affiliated, so the presidential preference.
Right, just as an illustration, so for our general elections in Arizona, you're going to have a lot less ballot styles because you don't have a partisan ballot that somebody can pick if they're not affiliated with any party. But even in our primaries, where we have open primaries where if you're not affiliated with a political party, you can pick a D or an R, you can't pick an L, because the Libertarian Party in Arizona is a closed primary, even in an open primary setting. Let's add to the confusion, which is what happened in 2000.
Totally understand
yeah, so
that.
we have essentially in Arizona, and I think a lot of other states too, that separate presidential preference election that lands outside of the typical primary/general pattern. Our primary is really late, August to November, during our general election cycles, but then we have a March presidential preference election. And so the only folks that can cast a ballot there are registered party members. If you're not affiliated with a political party, if you're affiliated with a political party that doesn't have a candidate on the ballot, you cannot cast a ballot in that election for the presidential preference election. So we do have a jumble of rules.
Yeah, it gets very confusing, and if I were to do a good Johnny Carson, I would say in the next presidential preference election in Arizona, there will be long lines because there will be, in Maricopa, between 26 and 28,000 unaffiliated voters that will appear to vote
Well, there's
that
going to
are
be
ineligible.
20,000 presidential candidates too, so
So
you know.
that's part of the challenge, right? Is that, again, the rules of engagement can be complicated and confusing, and sometimes not what the voters either understand and or want. So are we serving our voters, or what exactly is it that we are intending to do? All right, great question. Another question. We have about 4 minutes left.
Hi, I'm Audra Thomas, and I have a question that goes along with the voter education and what you can do to inform voters how to fill out a ballot, because I hear that that's kind of a big issue, and especially with new people that are registering to vote, they don't necessarily know, they get to the voting place and they're like, oh, what do I do now? What type of education efforts are there currently? And then has there been any thought to using like video or QR codes or anything like that, so where the voter is either in line to vote and they can like pull it up on their phone and watch really quickly, like, okay, this is how you fill out your ballot, or on absentee and mail-in ballots, having a QR code or a link to the county website that has a short video on what to do, because from my experience, a lot of people don't pay attention to written directions, but a more interactive or more dynamic video type of instruction might be more effective.
And I think what's layered in here is that some of our voting equipment is not intuitive like the smart technology we're accustomed to. So we're not accustomed to having to read instructions because, of course, we're all very smart people and we know how to use a machine.
So we
But
have
what are you all
videos,
doing?
but it doesn't change anything. We do have videos on our website. We have videos on every laptop in the polling place. You can pull them up yourself. The reality is people don't want to follow directions. So, I mean, it is what it is. And that's the same we even went to, which was part of the civic design. We use a picture. I mean, to me, filling in the oval, if I have a big picture right up there with an oval completely filled in, that should tell you something. You don't have to read any of it, and they still choose not to do that. In addition, with our curbside voters and our provisionals, someone is standing right there saying to you, now please fill in that oval, and they still do not fill it in. But some of that can also be, obviously, if you're voting curbside, there's a reason you're not getting out of your car. Are you capable of filling in the oval?
We're fortunate that we have one of those more intuitive voting systems. If you voted here today and have one of these little stickers, you're using the privacy shields that I brought from Arlington County. And you can see my voting instructions in there. It's very simple. Ours is a digital scan system which has a red box, and all the voter has to do is make a mark in the box, period. We really like that. You don't have to completely fill in an oval in order for the vote to count. We feel very comfortable with this type of system, and it's resulted in very few mismarked ballots, particularly at the polls on Election Day. Most of the issues we have are people overvote.
So I believe it was in Florida in 2008 when we transitioned to optical scan. We allowed the counties to have like a Donald Duck, Mickey Mouse ballot. And when the individuals checked in to vote, they literally, the poll worker would direct them to this and say, fill in the oval. And they would literally practice to fill in the oval before they went to go vote their optical scan ballot. And I think that it helped with the transition. You know, it was a statewide transition. And in a presidential election year, we needed all the help we could get.
I think it's a great idea to be able to utilize sort of that magical piece of technology that we all carry around in our pockets and purses, snap a QR code, look at a video, watch what's going on, and make those things available. We're probably going to end up stealing that idea in Maricopa County that you just presented, because it's a great idea, like we've stolen ideas from other places around the country.
We all do.
We're super passionate about like stealing bests from each other, but it's all, I think, in the spirit of moving forward so that we can serve our voters better. The voters' experience is, in my mind, paramount when we talk about all of this. But that also includes the faith that the voters have in the integrity of our systems, our capacity to prove up with real facts and real data the work that we're doing and how effective we're doing it. So it doesn't just go to, this is how you fill it in, it goes to all of the other aspects of it as well. So if anybody's watching over in Arizona, and again, happy birthday, that idea is, I think we're going to move to that direction.
We found partnerships were invaluable in that endeavor, educating voters. So our clerk of the circuit court If it's not bad enough, you get called for jury duty, you get to listen to me speak for a few minutes and educate voters on vote by mail ballots do count, not just in close elections, the importance of your signature. We have staff there to make sure that your address is current. Our property appraiser, we partnered with our property appraiser, and we have inserts that go in there to every person that purchased a home, and it averages several thousand a week. And it gives them a link to our website for FAQs on exactly what you're talking about. And I'm so stealing that, by the way, for the absentee vote by mail, like a little link to go.
Yeah, and that I think is really part of what's important in all of this, is making sure that you know the data of what's happening in your own jurisdiction or in your state, to know where the voters are falling through the cracks, to know what it is that you need to be emphasizing, what voter education you need to be doing. Is it the fact that you need to make sure that they know, if you don't sign this, we don't have a cure period. If you don't sign it, it's not going to count. Or if you don't fill this in fully, someone else is going to be deciding what you mean on your ballot. So knowing where the data points you to improve, I think everyone has opportunities to do so. So with that, I want to thank my fabulous panelists, and thank you all for sharing your Valentine's Day with us. Yay. Are you going to kick us off to lunch? Excellent.
All right, so we're going to go over to that room over there for lunch and bring it back here. We have about 30 minutes before our next panel. It's going to be an exciting one with Facebook, Twitter, and Uber. So you have your 30-minute break now. Oh, also, if you want to vote in our poll outside, the polls will close at the end of the break.